A 13-year-old boy walks into a room full of outlaws carrying a red notebook filled with 47 lies. Every single one points to his father, the most trusted man in town, the same man whose charity feeds hundreds, the same man whose wife vanished 6 months ago without a trace. Nobody believed the boy. Not the police, not the teachers, not the neighbors who smiled at his father every Sunday morning, but tonight, under the flicker of a dying fluorescent light inside the Iron Ledger clubhouse, a crew of scarred, battle-worn bikers will listen, and what they hear will drag them into the darkest fight they've never asked for. If this story satisfies you, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and stay with me until the very end. Because this one doesn't let go. The coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago. Nobody bothered to make a fresh pot. That was the kind of morning it was inside the Iron Ledger clubhouse. The kind where men sat in their own silence, like it was a second skin, where the overhead lights buzzed at a frequency that matched the low-grade headache behind Cooper Daines's left eye, and where the smell of old motor oil and stale tobacco had soaked so deep into the walls that no amount of ventilation would ever pull it out. A Tuesday in late November. Gray sky pressing down on the roof like a hand trying to smother the building. Wind rattling the chain-link fence out back. Temperature sitting just above freezing, which meant just cold enough to make your bones remember every bad decision you'd ever made. Cooper sat at the long table near the back wall, both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had a crack running from the rim to the handle. 46 years old, 6'2", shoulders built for labor that never ended. His knuckles were scarred from 20 years of work that had nothing to do with wrenches, and his left knee clicked when he stood up too fast. A souvenir from a roadside accident outside Barstow that he never talked about and nobody ever asked about. He was the president of the Iron Ledger, which meant he carried the decisions nobody else wanted to carry, and he did it with the kind of quiet authority that made younger men either respect him or avoid his eyes entirely. Across the room, Macklin was pulling apart a carburetor on a sheet of newspaper. 53. Former Army mechanic. 2 tours. Hands that could rebuild a transmission blindfolded but shook like leaves when he tried to hold a pen. He hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 6 years, and the dark circles under his eyes had become so permanent they looked like bruises that would never heal. He didn't talk about why. The club didn't ask. Near the window, Dex sat on a metal folding chair with his boots crossed on the sill, reading a water-stained paperback with the cover torn off. 38. Lean. A scar running from his right ear to his jaw that he told different stories about depending on who was asking. He was the club's sergeant-at-arms, which meant when something needed doing that nobody wanted to do, Dex did it, and he did it without asking questions that would make the answers harder to live with. 3 other members drifted through the space. Roach near the jukebox, Brennan in the kitchen doorway, Harlan leaning against his bike near the garage entrance. But the clubhouse felt emptier than 6 men should have made it. That was the thing about the Iron Ledger. They filled a room the way smoke fills a room. Present everywhere, touching nothing, disappearing the moment you opened a door. The front entrance was a heavy steel thing that scraped the concrete floor every time it moved. When it opened at 9:47 that morning, the sound cut through the silence like a blade. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was a boy, skinny, pale, brown hair that hadn't been cut in weeks, hanging over his forehead in uneven strands. He wore a jacket 2 sizes too big, the kind of jacket you inherit, not the kind you choose, and his sneakers were soaked through, which meant he'd walked here through the frost. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. Cooper knew the difference. He'd seen it in men twice this boy's age, the shaking that comes from inside. From something sitting in your chest that you've been carrying so long, your body doesn't know how to put it down. The boy was holding a red notebook. "You lost?" Macklin said without looking up from the carburetor. The boy didn't flinch, didn't move. His eyes swept the room. Not the way a scared kid scans for exits, but the way someone scans for the one person who might actually listen. His gaze landed on Cooper. "I need to talk to someone," the boy said. His voice was steady. Too steady for 13. The kind of steady that comes from rehearsal, from standing in front of a bathroom mirror and practicing the words until they stop shaking in your mouth. Cooper set his mug down. "About what?" The boy opened the notebook. "I counted 47 lies this week." The room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the air shifted. Macklin's hand stopped moving over the carburetor. Dex lowered the paperback. Roach stepped away from the jukebox. It was the kind of shift that happens when men who have spent their lives reading danger in small details suddenly recognize it in the voice of a child. "Whose lies?" Cooper asked. "My father's." Cooper studied the boy for a long moment. Thin wrists, hollowed cheeks, a bruise on his left forearm, partially hidden by the oversized sleeve, that was yellowing at the edges. At least 4 days old. The boy stood the way certain animals stand when they've learned that running doesn't help. Still, watchful, ready to absorb whatever came next. "What's your name?" "Charlie." "Charlie Marsh." The name landed different than it should have. Macklin looked up. Dex closed the book entirely. Even Brennan stepped out of the kitchen doorway. Daniel Marsh. Everybody in Ridgehaven knew the name. Founder of the Valley Bridge Foundation. The man who organized winter coat drives, food bank expansions, disaster relief fundraisers. His face was on the side of buses. His handshake was in every newspaper photo. He sat on the city council's advisory board. He spoke at school assemblies about community and responsibility and giving back. When the floods hit 2 years ago, Daniel Marsh's foundation was the first to deliver supplies. When the elementary school needed a new roof, Daniel Marsh's charity wrote the check. He was, by every visible measure, the best man in Ridgehaven, and his 13-year-old son had just walked into an outlaw motorcycle clubhouse to say that everything about him was a lie. Cooper pulled out a chair, not gently, not dramatically, just pulled it out and pushed it toward the boy with his boot. "Sit down." Charlie sat. He placed the red notebook on the table and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small, precise, and angry. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who knows nobody will read it, but writes everything down anyway because the act of recording is the only control they have left. "6 months ago, my mother disappeared," Charlie said. "Her name is Miranda. My father told everyone she went overseas for volunteer work. The Valley Bridge Foundation posted about it on their website. There was a farewell dinner. People gave speeches." He paused. "She never packed a suitcase. Her passport is still in the desk drawer in my father's office." I checked. The room was silent. I started writing things down after she left. Times, dates, license plates, the trucks that come to the foundation warehouse after midnight, the phone calls my father takes in the garage with the door locked, the money. Charlie turned a page. 3 separate bank accounts that don't match the foundation's public records, wire transfers to companies that don't exist, cargo manifests for shipments that never arrive at the locations listed. Cooper leaned forward. "How do you know the companies don't exist?" "I looked them up. County Business Registry, state and corporation records. 2 of them have addresses that are empty lots. The third is a storage unit outside of town registered to a name my father uses sometimes when he doesn't want to be Daniel Marsh." Macklin set the carburetor down. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to the table. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and looked at the notebook the way a man looks at a wound he recognizes. 47 lies, Charlie said again. "This week alone." "Why here?" Dex asked from the window. His voice wasn't hostile, it was careful. "Why not the police?" Charlie's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Something old and tired that no 13-year-old should be carrying. "I went to the police twice. The first time they told me my father is a respected member of the community and that I should talk to my school counselor. The second time they called my father to come pick me up." The words hung in the air like exhaust fumes. "What happened when he picked you up?" Cooper asked. Charlie pulled back his left sleeve. The bruise was darker than it looked from across the room. Wider, shaped like fingers. Nobody spoke. Cooper had seen a lot of things in his life. He'd ridden through towns that had given up on themselves. He'd buried friends who didn't make it home from wars that nobody remembered. He'd sat in rooms where men twice his size broke down and wept because the world had finally pressed hard enough to crack them open. But there was something about a child sitting perfectly still with a bruise shaped like a grown man's hand that reached into a part of him he'd spent years trying to wall off. He looked at Macklin. Macklin gave a single nod, almost invisible. The kind of nod that means, "I see what you see." "You said your mother's passport is still in the house," Cooper said, top left drawer, under a stack of insurance documents. And nobody, no family, no friends, has actually spoken to her since she left. My aunt called 3 times. My father answered Miranda's phone each time, told her mom was in a remote area with limited reception. After the 3rd call, my aunt stopped trying. Charlie paused. I tried to call the number myself. It rings, but nobody answers. The voicemail was changed. It used to be her voice. Now it's automated. Cooper pushed back from the table. His chair scraped against the concrete floor. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where a row of motorcycles sat under the gray sky like sleeping animals. Rain was starting, light, cold, the kind that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air, turning everything it touches into something heavier. Macklin, he said without turning around. Yeah. Pull everything you can find on the Valley Bridge Foundation. Tax filings, property records, board of directors, everything. On it. Dex. Here. I need eyes on the warehouse Charlie mentioned. Night rotation. Don't engage, don't approach, just watch and record. Dex was already pulling on his jacket. Cooper turned back to Charlie. The boy hadn't moved. His hands were flat on the table, on either side of the open notebook. He was watching Cooper with an expression that Cooper recognized immediately. Not hope, because hope requires believing someone will actually help, and this boy had been let down too many times for that. It was something more cautious than hope, something more fragile. It was the last thread before giving up. You're going to stay here tonight, Cooper said. My father will notice I'm gone. Let him notice. He'll come looking. Let him come. Charlie stared at Cooper for a long time. Then, for the first time since he walked through that door, something in his posture changed. Not a lot. Just the slightest release in his shoulders, the smallest exhale, like a wire that had been pulled tight for months finally loosened by a single degree. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that could become trust if nobody broke it. Brennan brought the boy a plate of food, scrambled eggs, toast, black coffee that Charlie looked at, smelled, and pushed aside in favor of a glass of water. He ate slowly, mechanically, the way someone eats when they've forgotten that food is supposed to be something other than fuel. The bikers gave him space. They understood space. Most of them had spent years needing it themselves. By afternoon, Macklin had spread 6 pages of printed records across the pool table in the back room. Cooper stood over them with his arms crossed, reading in silence. The Valley Bridge Foundation had raised $4.2 million in the past 18 months. According to the public filings, every dollar had been allocated to community programs, food distribution, housing assistance, emergency relief, youth services. The numbers looked clean, the reports looked professional, the audits looked thorough. But Macklin had found the seams. 3 shell companies, Macklin said, tapping a page with his index finger, registered in different states, all incorporated within 2 months of each other, all using variations of the same registered agent. Funds flow from the foundation into these companies as contracted services, but there are no contracts on file, no invoices, no deliverables. The money goes in and doesn't come back. How much? Cooper asked. Conservatively, $2.3 million over 14 months. Cooper's jaw tightened. And nobody flagged this? The foundation's auditor is a firm called Greystone Financial. Small outfit, 2 partners. One of them sits on the Valley Bridge Advisory Board. Macklin paused. So no, nobody flagged it. The corruption wasn't accidental. It was architectural. Daniel Marsh hadn't stumbled into fraud. He'd built an entire system designed to funnel money through invisible channels, protected by the very people who were supposed to be watching. The charity was the mask, the community trust was the shield, and anyone who got too close to the truth got handled, quietly, efficiently, completely, like Miranda. Cooper looked at the records for a long time. Then he looked at the doorway where Charlie was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, red notebook open on his knees, adding another entry. This kid's been doing our job, Cooper said quietly. Better than most adults I know, Macklin replied. Night came early, the way it does in late November, not gradually, but suddenly, like someone pulling a curtain across the sky. The temperature dropped. The rain turned to something between sleet and mist. The clubhouse windows fogged from the inside. Dex called in at 8:14 p.m. I'm at the warehouse, he said. His voice was low, controlled, muffled by wind. 2 trucks showed up 20 minutes ago. No foundation markings. Plain white panels. They backed up to the loading dock and started unloading. Crates. Heavy. Takes 2 men per crate. Cargo? Cooper asked. Can't tell from here, but whatever it is, it's not winter coats. Stay on it. Don't move. Cooper. Dex paused. There's something else. A black sedan parked on the far side of the lot. Been sitting there since before the trucks arrived. Engine running, tinted windows. Someone's watching the operation, and it isn't us. Cooper hung up. He stood in the middle of the clubhouse, surrounded by the hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of sleet against the windows, and felt the weight of the decision forming in his chest. He'd been carrying decisions like this for 20 years, each one heavier than the last, each one leaving behind a little more scar tissue on parts of himself he didn't look at anymore. This wasn't their fight. Charlie Marsh wasn't their blood. The Iron Ledger didn't owe this town a single thing. Ridgehaven had treated them the way every small town treats men who ride loud machines and wear leather and don't apologize for existing. With suspicion, with distance, with the kind of polite contempt that hides behind zoning regulations and noise complaints and cross to the other side of the street silence. But there was a boy sitting on the floor of his clubhouse with a bruise shaped like his father's hand and a notebook full of evidence that nobody in the entire system had been willing to read. Cooper had been that boy once. Different details, same architecture. A father who wore one face for the world and another for the house. A mother who disappeared, not into a fake overseas assignment, but into a silence so total it might as well have been the same thing. A system that looked at a child's bruises and decided they were less important than a man's reputation. Nobody had come for Cooper. He'd ridden out of that life on a stolen motorcycle at 17 with nothing but a duffel bag, and a fury that took him a decade to turn into something other than self-destruction. He walked to where Charlie was sitting. The boy looked up. His eyes were clear and watchful in the dim light. "Your mother," Cooper said, "before she disappeared. Did she ever say anything about what your father was doing? Did she know?" Charlie closed the notebook, his fingers pressed against the cover. "She knew. That's why she's gone." "What do you mean?" 3 weeks before she disappeared, I heard them arguing. Late at night, I was supposed to be asleep. She told him she'd found the accounts, the real ones. She said she was going to report him. Charlie's voice didn't waver, but his hands tightened on the notebook. He told her that was a very dangerous thing to say. Then he went quiet. My father is most dangerous when he's quiet. And 3 weeks later, she was gone. The foundation posted a photo of her at the airport, smiling, waving, holding a carry-on bag. Charlie looked directly at Cooper. "That photo was taken 2 years ago, at my cousin's wedding. I was standing right next to her when it was taken. They cropped me out." The revelation landed like a fist to the sternum. Macklin, who had been listening from the doorway, turned and walked to the pool table. He came back with a printed page, one of the foundation's public posts. The photo was there. A woman smiling, waving, holding a bag. It looked candid, natural, like a departure photo, like proof of a goodbye that everyone wanted to believe was real. "The kid's right," Macklin said. Reverse image search pulled the original from a social media archive. Same photo, different crop, 2 years old. Cooper looked at the photo, then at Charlie, then at the dark windows where sleet was drawing lines down the glass. "She's alive," Charlie said. "I know she is. Because if she wasn't, he wouldn't need to keep lying about where she is." The logic was devastating in its simplicity and in its accuracy. Cooper pulled out his phone and called Dex. "Change of plans. I need you to pull the surveillance footage from the Foundation's warehouse. Everything from the past 6 months. Security cameras, traffic cameras, anything with a lens pointed at that building. That's going to take time. Then start now." He hung up and looked at Macklin. "Wake up Harlan. I need him running background on every property Daniel Marsh has ever owned, rented, leased, or had access to. Every building, every plot of land, every storage unit. If this man put Miranda somewhere, there's a paper trail. And if there isn't, then there's a digital one, or a human one. Someone knows where she is. People don't disappear without help." By midnight, the clubhouse had transformed. The pool table was buried under documents. 3 laptops glowed in the dark. Macklin had mapped the shell company network across a whiteboard with arrows and dates. Harlan had identified 14 properties connected to Daniel Marsh or his business associates. Dex had sent back 37 minutes of warehouse footage showing unmarked trucks and unidentified men moving crates at hours when the foundation was supposedly closed. Charlie had fallen asleep on the old leather couch near the wall. His red notebook was clutched against his chest. His sneakers were still wet. In sleep, the careful composure he'd maintained all day dissolved, and what was left was just a boy, thin, exhausted, bruised, curled on his side in a room full of strangers who were the first people in 6 months to take him seriously. Cooper stood in the doorway watching him. Behind him, Macklin approached. "Cooper." "Yeah." "I found something." Macklin's voice was different, lower. The tone he used when the news was bad enough that he needed to prepare the listener before delivering it. "One of the properties on Marsh's network is a place called Pine Ridge Wellness Retreat, private facility. Registered as a mental health treatment center. No public reviews, no listed patients, no staff directory. Completely off the grid." "Where?" 40 miles north, deep in the national forest. Single access road. The property records show it was purchased 18 months ago by one of the shell companies. The deed transfer was handled by the same attorney who incorporated all 3 shells. Cooper turned to face him. "You think Miranda's there?" Macklin didn't answer immediately. He pulled out his phone and showed Cooper a satellite image. A cluster of buildings surrounded by dense forest. A single road leading in. No nearby structures, no nearby traffic. The kind of place you put something when you don't want anyone to find it. "I think if you wanted to make someone disappear without actually making them disappear," Macklin said, "this is exactly where you'd put them." Cooper stared at the image. The buildings looked small against the vast dark green of the forest. Isolated. Hidden. Like a secret buried so deep in the earth that only someone willing to dig with their bare hands would ever reach it. He looked back at Charlie sleeping on the couch, a boy who had dug with his bare hands for 6 months. "Tomorrow night," Cooper said, "we ride." Macklin nodded, then he paused. "Cooper, one more thing." "What?" "The black sedan Dex spotted at the warehouse. I ran the plates." Macklin's face was unreadable, but his eyes carried something that Cooper hadn't seen in them before, a wariness that bordered on fear. "It's registered to the Ridgehaven County Sheriff's Department." The air in the room went cold. Not the cold from outside, not the cold from November. The cold that comes when you realize the people who are supposed to protect a town are the same people helping destroy it. Cooper's hand tightened around his phone. The screen lit his face in pale blue. Behind him, Charlie slept. In front of him, the satellite image glowed with the coordinates of a place where a woman might be held captive by the system that was supposed to keep her safe. And somewhere in the dark, in a warm house on a well-lit street, behind a door that the whole town trusted, Daniel Marsh was sitting perfectly still, wondering why his son hadn't come home. Cooper didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the front window with his boots flat on the concrete floor, watching the parking lot through fogged glass while the rest of the clubhouse settled into the uneasy quiet that passes for peace among men who've forgotten what peace actually feels like. The sleet had stopped around 2 in the morning, replaced by a stillness so absolute that every small sound became enormous. The tick of the old wall clock above the bar, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the occasional creak of the building adjusting itself against the cold. Charlie was still asleep on the leather couch, curled into a position that made him look smaller than he already was, the red notebook pressed against his chest like a shield. At 4:17 a.m., Cooper's phone vibrated. Dex. "I pulled what I could from the traffic cameras on Route 9. 3-month window. Every Tuesday and Thursday night between midnight and 3 a.m., the same 2 unmarked trucks take the same route north." A pause. Wind in the background. The distant sound of a diesel engine idling. 41 miles up, there's a turnoff onto a fire road. No cameras past that point. But guess where that fire road leads? Pine Ridge. Straight to the front gate. Cooper exhaled through his nose. The glass in front of him fogged for a moment, then cleared. "Come back. We need to talk." "One more thing." Dex's voice dropped. Not in volume, but in register. The way a man's voice drops when he's about to say something he wishes he didn't have to. I drove past Marsh's house on the way back, lights on in the downstairs study. 3 vehicles in the driveway. One of them is a county sheriff's cruiser. Cooper said nothing for a long time. "Cooper, I heard you. Come back." He hung up and stared at the phone in his hand. The screen went dark. His reflection stared back at him. Half a face, cut by shadow, older than he remembered. By 6 a.m., the clubhouse was awake. Not because anyone had slept well, but because the kind of tension that had settled into the building overnight made rest impossible. Brennan made coffee, strong, bitter, the color of engine oil, and set mugs on the long table without asking who wanted one. Everyone took one. That was how mornings worked in the Iron Ledger. You took the coffee. You sat down. You waited for someone to say the thing that needed saying. Cooper said it. "The sheriff's department is involved." The words landed on the table like a dropped wrench, heavy, final, ringing. Roach, 31, youngest full member, a former welder with burn scars crawling up both forearms and a temper that ran hotter than the acetylene torches he used to work with, pushed back from the table. Involved how? A county cruiser was at Marsh's house at 4 in the morning, the same department that sent Charlie home when he tried to report his father. The same department whose vehicle was parked at the warehouse during an off-books cargo transfer. "That could be coincidence," Roach said, but his voice didn't believe its own words. "It's not," Charlie said. Everyone turned. The boy was standing in the doorway between the main room and the hallway, red notebook in hand, hair flattened on one side from the couch cushion. He looked like he'd been awake for a while, listening. "The sheriff's name is Dale Whitmore," Charlie said. "He comes to dinner at our house once a month. He and my father play cards in the study with the door closed. They've been doing it since before I was born." Charlie opened the notebook and flipped to a page near the middle. 7 weeks ago, I heard Sheriff Whitmore on the phone with my father. He said, "The route is clean through the end of the year. Nobody's asking questions." Then he laughed. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, physical weight, the kind that presses on your chest and makes your breathing shallow. Macklin rubbed his face with both hands. "So we're not just going up against a charity fraud, we're going up against the charity fraud and the law." "We're going up against a system," Cooper said. "Marsh built it, the sheriff protects it, and Miranda found out about it and got buried." "She's not buried," Charlie said sharply. "She's alive." Cooper looked at the boy. "I know, that's what I mean." The room settled into the kind of uncomfortable equilibrium that precedes an argument, everyone aware that the next word spoken would determine the direction of everything that followed. Cooper could feel it the way you feel a storm before you see it. The pressure drop, the change in the air. Harlan broke first. "I need to say something." He was standing near the garage entrance, arms crossed, his gray beard catching the overhead light. 58. The oldest member. Former Marine. 2 Purple Hearts he kept in a cigar box under his bed and never showed anyone. He'd been with the Iron Ledger since before Cooper took over, since the days when the club was smaller, quieter, and less inclined to involve itself in anything beyond its own survival. "I need to say it out loud so it's on the record." Cooper waited. "This is not our fight." The words hit differently than expected. Not because they were wrong. In a certain light, from a certain angle, they were absolutely right. But because Harlan was the one saying them. Harlan, who had carried wounded men through mortar fire. Harlan, who had once driven 8 hours through a blizzard to pull a club brother out of a situation that should have killed both of them. Harlan, who believed in loyalty the way most people believe in gravity. As something so fundamental it didn't require discussion. "A man's got a right to state his position," Cooper said carefully. "Then here's my position. We're talking about raiding a private facility 40 miles outside of town, in the dark, against a target protected by local law enforcement, based on the notebook of a 13-year-old kid we met yesterday. If this goes wrong, and Cooper, listen to me, because I have buried enough friends to know what wrong looks like. If this goes wrong, the club is done. Not damaged, done. Every one of us ends up in a cell, and the kid ends up back with his father, and nobody wins." "So what's your suggestion?" Dex asked from the window. His voice was neutral, but his eyes weren't. "We hand the kid back? Tell him sorry, we checked. Turns out your dad really is the monster you said he was. But it's not our problem? That's not what I said. That's what you mean. What I mean, Harlan said, his voice hardening, is that there are other ways to handle this. Contact a journalist, leak the documents, send an anonymous tip to the state attorney general's office. Let the system. Macklin's voice cut through like a blade. He was standing at the whiteboard, still holding the marker he'd been using to map the shell companies. His hands were shaking again, the old tremor, the one that never fully went away. And there was something in his face that Cooper recognized immediately. Not anger, something deeper, something that lived in the marrow. The system is the one that gave Charlie a bruise shaped like his father's hand and told him to talk to his school counselor. The system is the one with a sheriff's cruiser parked in Marsh's driveway at 4 a.m. You want to send a tip to the state attorney general? Great. And while we wait 6 months for someone to open an envelope, Miranda stays in a concrete room in the middle of a forest. Harlan's jaw tightened. Mac, don't. Macklin set the marker down. His voice had dropped to the register that made everyone in the room pay attention. The quiet that was worse than shouting. I sat in a room like that once. Not the same room, not the same country, but the same concrete, the same locked door, the same silence that makes you forget what your own name sounds like. His eyes were fixed on a point on the wall that nobody else could see. I know what happens to people who stay in those rooms while the system takes its time. Nobody spoke. Cooper watched Macklin's face and understood, with the clarity that comes from years of proximity to someone's damage, that this conversation had stopped being about strategy and become about something else entirely. Every man in this room carried a version of the same wound, a door that should have opened and didn't, a person who should have come and never did, a system that measured their suffering against its own convenience and decided they could wait. Charlie was standing very still in the doorway watching. His eyes moved between the men, reading them, measuring them, recording them, with the same precision he applied to his notebook. I'll go alone if I have to, the boy said. Every head turned. I've been doing this alone for 6 months. I can keep doing it. His voice was flat, not brave, not defiant, just the voice of someone who has accepted the absence of help as a permanent condition and adjusted accordingly. I'm not asking you to save me. I came here because I thought you might listen. You did. That's already more than anyone else. He turned and walked back toward the couch. Cooper's chest felt like someone had reached inside it and squeezed. He looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at the doorway where Charlie had disappeared. I didn't say I wouldn't go, Harlan said quietly. I said it's not our fight. Sometimes those are the ones that matter, Cooper replied. Harlan met his eyes. Something passed between them. Not agreement exactly, but something older and heavier. The recognition that they were both right, and that being right wasn't going to protect anyone. Tomorrow night, Harlan said, but we do it smart, and we have an exit plan. We'll have an exit plan, a real one, not a figure it out when we get there plan. A real one. Harlan unfolded his arms, picked up his coffee, and drank it in one long pull. Then he set the mug down, turned, and walked into the garage without another word. The rest of the morning was preparation. Macklin printed satellite maps of the Pine Ridge property and taped them to the wall. 4 buildings arranged in a loose rectangle around a central courtyard, a single paved road leading in from the south, dense forest on all sides, no secondary access, no visible security cameras on the exterior, which meant either the security was internal or sophisticated enough to be invisible. Dex cleaned and inspected 4 sets of night vision optics he kept in a locked case under his workbench. Former military surplus. Old but functional. He laid them out on a table with the same careful attention a surgeon gives to instruments before an operation. Roach checked the bikes, oil levels, tire pressure, chain tension, battery voltage. He moved between the motorcycles with the focused efficiency of a man who understands that a machine is only as reliable as the last person who touched it. Brennan inventoried communications equipment, 2-way radios, prepaid phones, signal boosters. He tested each one, marking frequencies and ranges on a chart he pinned next to Macklin's satellite maps. Cooper stood in the center of it all, directing without commanding, adjusting without micromanaging, watching his men prepare for something that looked like a military operation but felt like something else entirely. Something personal, something that each of them was doing for reasons they would never fully articulate, because the reasons lived in parts of themselves they'd learned to protect with silence. By early afternoon, the plan had taken shape. They would ride north after dark, 6 bikes, staggered formation, running lights off for the last 10 miles. Macklin and Harlan would approach the facility from the east through the tree line. Cooper and Dex would take the south entrance. Roach and Brennan would hold position at the Fire Road Junction as lookouts and communication relay. The objective was simple: confirm Miranda's presence and extract her. No confrontation unless absolutely necessary. No engagement with security unless there was no alternative. The reality, of course, would be nothing like the plan. It never was. At 3:30 p.m., something happened that nobody expected. The front door of the clubhouse opened, and a woman walked in. She was mid-40s, dark hair streaked with gray, pulled back tight, a wool coat over a county government ID badge. No-nonsense posture, eyes that had spent decades looking at problems and calculating solutions without the luxury of sentiment. She stopped just inside the doorway and surveyed the room the way an inspector surveys a building, not with contempt, but with the clinical detachment of someone who has already made up her mind about what she's going to find. "Which one of you is Cooper Danes?" she said. Cooper stepped forward. "Who's asking?" "My name is Sharon Kessler. I'm the assistant district attorney for this county." She looked at the maps on the wall, the satellite images, the shell company diagrams, the stack of printed financial records on the pool table. Then she looked back at Cooper. "And based on what I'm seeing in this room, you and I have the same problem." Nobody moved. "You've been investigating Daniel Marsh," she said. It wasn't a question. "We've been reading a kid's notebook," Cooper replied. "I know about the notebook, I know about the boy, and I know about Pine Ridge." The temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees, or at least it felt like it. "How?" Macklin asked. "Because I've been investigating Marsh for 8 months. Sharon Kessler reached into her coat and pulled out a manila folder. She walked to the table and set it down, opening it to reveal a stack of documents, official documents, with county seals and case numbers and redaction bars. The Valley Bridge Foundation has been flagged by the state comptroller's office since last year. Wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. We've been building a case. "For 8 months, Cooper said. His voice was flat. "These things take time." "A woman has been missing for 6. The words hit their target. Sharon Kessler's jaw tightened, a crack in the clinical exterior, small but visible. "I know. And if it's any consolation, that's the reason I'm standing in a biker clubhouse right now, instead of waiting for the process to work." Cooper studied her for a long moment. "Why come to us?" "Because the sheriff is compromised." She said it without flinching, like someone peeling a bandage off a wound they'd been tending alone. "Dale Whitmore has been protecting Marsh for at least 3 years. I can't go to local law enforcement. I can't go to the county police because Whitmore has allies embedded in their chain of command. And if I go to the FBI, the jurisdictional handoff will take weeks. Weeks during which Marsh will have every opportunity to destroy evidence and relocate anyone he needs to relocate." "Including Miranda," Macklin said. "Including Miranda." She paused. "I need someone who can get to Pine Ridge tonight. Someone outside the system. Someone Marsh isn't watching." "You're the assistant DA," Dex said from the window, "and you're asking a motorcycle club to do your job for you." "I'm asking you to do what the system can't do fast enough." She met Dex's stare without blinking. "I've read your files. All of you. I know who you are. I know what you've done. And I know that half of you should probably have records longer than the ones I've seen, which means you're either very careful or very lucky. But right now, I don't care about any of that. Right now, there is a woman being held in a facility in the middle of a national forest by a man who has the local sheriff in his pocket. And the only people in this county who are both willing and able to do something about it tonight are standing in this room." Silence. Cooper picked up the manila folder. He flipped through it slowly. Financial records that mirrored everything Macklin had found, but with official confirmation. Witness statements from former Foundation employees who had noticed irregularities and been quietly dismissed. A sealed affidavit from a county auditor who had flagged the shell companies and then suddenly retired. And at the bottom, a photograph. A surveillance photo. Grainy, taken from a distance. A woman, thin, dark-haired, mid-30s, standing behind a window with bars on it. Miranda Marsh. Cooper showed the photo to Charlie, who had appeared in the doorway again. The boy looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. "That's her," he said. His voice broke on the second word, just barely. A fracture in the foundation he'd spent 6 months building to hold himself together. He closed his eyes, pressed his lips together, and breathed through his nose until the fracture sealed itself shut. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Cooper with an expression that was no longer the cautious, almost hope from the night before. It was certainty. Cooper turned to Sharon Kessler. "If we go in tonight and find her, what happens after?" "I have a federal judge who's agreed to issue an emergency warrant based on the evidence I've compiled. The moment you confirm Miranda's location and condition, I make the call. FBI takes over within hours. Marsh gets arrested. Whitmore gets arrested. The entire network comes down." "And us?" "You were never there." Cooper looked at his men, one by one. Macklin, whose hands had stopped shaking for the first time all day. Dex, already wearing his jacket. Roach, standing beside his bike with his arms folded. Brennan, checking radio frequencies with the concentration of a man who has decided that, whatever comes next, he's going to be ready for it. Harlan, leaning in the garage doorway with his coffee mug empty and his expression unreadable but present. Fully, irreversibly present. "Tonight," Cooper said, "we ride at sundown." The preparation shifted from careful to urgent. Macklin updated the approach routes based on information from Kessler's files. A secondary maintenance trail on the facility's northeast side that wasn't visible on commercial satellite images. Dex redistributed the night vision sets and added a pair of bolt cutters and a signal jammer to his kit. Harlan pulled Cooper aside in the garage and said 4 words. "I still think this is dangerous. I know. But I'm going. I know." That was all. At 5:48 p.m., the sun dropped behind the ridgeline west of Ridgehaven. The sky turned the color of a bruise to purple and gray and swollen with the kind of darkness that doesn't just fall, but arrives, announced by the cold that rides ahead of it like a scout. 6 engines fired, one after another. The sound filled the parking lot the way thunder fills a valley. Not a noise, but a vibration. A physical thing that entered through your feet and climbed up through your bones until your entire skeleton hummed with it. Chrome caught the last light. Exhaust plumes rose white in the freezing air and dissolved into nothing. Cooper sat on his bike at the front of the formation. Behind him, Macklin, then Dex, then Harlan, then Roach, then Brennan. 6 men in black leather, faces hardened by wind and cold and the knowledge of what they were riding toward. Charlie stood on the clubhouse steps, watching. The red notebook was in his jacket pocket. His hands were at his sides. He looked older than 13 in that light, older and smaller at the same time, the way people look when they've carried something heavier than themselves for longer than anyone should. Cooper met the boy's eyes. He didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't offer any of the reassurances that would have been easy to give and impossible to keep. He just held the boy's gaze for a single long moment, then he dropped the clutch, and the formation pulled out into the darkness. The ride north took 53 minutes. They stayed off the main highway, taking back roads that wound through farmland and forest, in long, sweeping curves that the headlights carved out of the night like tunnels. Nobody spoke. The radios stayed silent. The only sound was the synchronized growl of 6 engines cutting through air that was cold enough to make your eyes water beneath your goggles. At mile 38, Cooper signaled, lights off. The formation went dark. They rode the last 15 miles by moonlight and memory, the road beneath them visible only as a slightly lighter shade of black against the black forest on either side. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Cooper's fingers ached inside his gloves. His breath came in short clouds that vanished behind him before they fully formed. The fire road turnoff appeared at 6:41 p.m., unmarked, narrow, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Roach and Brennan peeled off and positioned themselves at the junction. Engines killed, radios on, eyes scanning the darkness in both directions. Cooper led the remaining 4 bikes up the fire road at a crawl. Gravel crunched under tires, branches scraped against saddlebags. The forest closed around them like a throat swallowing. 3 miles in, they stopped. Cooper killed his engine. The others followed. Silence rushed in. Not the comfortable silence of the clubhouse, but the living silence of a forest at night, filled with the sounds of things you couldn't see. Wind in the canopy, the distant crack of a branch, the faint, barely perceptible hum of a generator somewhere ahead. They dismounted. Dex distributed night vision. The world turned green and grainy. Through the trees, 200 yards ahead, the Pine Ridge facility materialized like a ghost. 4 low buildings arranged around a darkened courtyard, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A single floodlight illuminated the southern entrance. A guard sat in a folding chair beside the gate, smoking a cigarette, the orange ember pulsing in the darkness like a heartbeat. 1 guard. That was less than expected, which meant either the facility relied on isolation rather than manpower, or the rest of the security was somewhere Cooper couldn't see. Macklin, Harlan, east approach, through the tree line, find the maintenance trail Kessler mentioned, radio when you're in position. 2 shadows detached from the group and vanished into the forest without a sound. Dex, with me, south entrance. We wait for their signal. Dex pulled the bolt cutters from his pack and slung them over his shoulder. His scar caught the moonlight. His eyes were calm. The particular calm of a man who has done difficult things in dark places before and discovered that the doing was always easier than the waiting. They moved. The forest floor was soft with pine needles and decades of decomposed leaves. Each step was deliberately placed. Heel, then toe, weight rolling forward, avoiding branches, avoiding roots, avoiding anything that would send sound across the 200 yards of darkness between them and the fence. At 100 yards, Cooper stopped. Something was wrong. He couldn't identify it immediately. It was a feeling, the kind of feeling that comes from 20 years of reading environments for threats, the subconscious pattern recognition that fires before the conscious mind catches up. Something about the facility didn't match. Something about the way the building sat. Something about the light. Then he saw it. The second building from the left. Upper floor. A window. Behind the glass, barely visible, a shape was moving. Not the shape of a guard or a worker. A shape that moved the way someone moves when they've been in the same room for a long time and have forgotten that there's a world outside of it. Slow, aimless, repetitive. The shape of someone pacing. Miranda. Dex saw it too. He touched Cooper's shoulder, pointed. Cooper nodded. The radio crackled once, Macklin's voice, barely above a whisper. East side. In position. Found the maintenance trail. Fence has a gap. Someone cut it a long time ago and patched it with zip ties. I can get through in 30 seconds. Hold, Cooper whispered. We go on my mark. He watched the guard at the south gate. The cigarette burned down to the filter. The guard dropped it, crushed it under his boot, and immediately lit another. His movements were bored. Routine. The movements of a man who has sat in the same chair on the same shift so many times that he's stopped actually watching. Cooper raised the radio to his mouth. Mark. 4 things happened simultaneously. Macklin cut through the zip ties on the east fence. Dex sprinted to the south gate and jammed the signal jammer into the guard's communication equipment. Cooper moved to the floodlight and killed the breaker. The facility went dark. The guard stood up. His chair scraped against the concrete. He reached for his radio. It was dead. Dex was on him before he could shout. Not violently, not brutally, but with the controlled, precise efficiency of a man who knows exactly how to restrain someone without causing permanent damage. Zip ties on the wrists, a gag fashioned from the guard's own bandana. The man's eyes were wide, but Dex leaned close and said something so quietly that even Cooper couldn't hear it. Whatever it was, the guard stopped struggling. They were inside the fence. The courtyard was dark. The generator hummed from somewhere behind the third building. The air smelled like diesel and damp concrete, and something else, something institutional. The smell of a place designed not for living, but for containing. Macklin and Harlan emerged from the east side, moving like shadows. Harlan carried a crowbar. Macklin carried nothing but his hands, which had stopped shaking entirely. Second building, upper floor, Cooper whispered. Miranda's up there. They moved to the entrance. The door was locked. Industrial-grade steel frame, electronic keypad. The signal jammer had killed the electronic lock's connection to whatever network controlled it, but the physical deadbolt was still engaged. Harlan stepped forward with the crowbar. One precise application of leverage, and the bolt sheared. The door swung inward. The hallway inside was dark and smelled of bleach. Fluorescent fixtures hung dead from the ceiling. The floor was linoleum, cracked and peeling. The walls were painted the kind of off-white that institutions use because it's cheap, not because it's comforting. Doors lined both sides, each one closed, each one fitted with a deadbolt and a viewing slot at eye level. Cooper's stomach tightened. This wasn't a wellness retreat. This was a holding facility, a place built to keep people locked in rooms and forgotten about. They climbed the stairs. Second floor. The hallway was identical. Same smell, same deadlights, same doors. Cooper moved to the third door on the left, the one positioned where he'd seen the shape pacing behind the window. He slid the viewing slot open. Inside, lit by moonlight falling through barred windows, a woman sat on the edge of a narrow bed. She was thin, thinner than the surveillance photo, thinner than anyone should be after 6 months. Her dark hair hung limp around a face that was pale and angular, the bones visible beneath the skin in a way that spoke of meals missed and sleep lost, and the slow erosion of a body that has been surviving instead of living. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were open, staring at the wall. She wasn't pacing anymore. She was sitting perfectly still, the way someone sits when they've stopped expecting the door to open. Cooper's throat tightened. Behind him, Macklin made a small sound, barely audible, barely human. The sound a man makes when a memory he's spent years burying claws its way back to the surface. Cooper broke the deadbolt. The door swung open. Miranda Marsh looked up. For a long moment, she didn't react. Her eyes moved across Cooper's face, the leather jacket, the road-weathered skin, the expression he was trying to keep steady, and then past him to Macklin, to Harlan, to Dex, standing at the end of the hallway. 4 strangers in black leather standing in a doorway that hadn't opened from the outside in 6 months. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Friends of your son," Cooper said. Something broke in her face. Not dramatically, not the way it breaks in movies, just a slow collapse, starting at the eyes and moving downward, like a wall giving way from the top. She pressed both hands against her mouth. Her shoulders drew inward. A sound came from behind her fingers that was too quiet to be a sob and too raw to be anything else. "Charlie," she said. "Is he—" "He's safe. He's at our clubhouse. He's been looking for you for 6 months." "Oh." The word fractured. She bent forward, hand still pressed to her mouth, and for a moment she was silent in a way that was louder than screaming. Macklin stepped forward and knelt beside her. His shaking hands, trembling again now, the adrenaline wearing off and the old damage flooding back, reached toward her and stopped, hovering in the space between contact and restraint. He didn't touch her. He just knelt there, close enough for her to feel the warmth of another person, and waited. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded. "Then we're leaving, right now." They moved fast, down the stairs, through the hallway, across the courtyard. Miranda walked between Cooper and Macklin, her feet bare on the cold concrete, her body trembling with every step. Dex led the way. Harlan covered the rear, crowbar still in hand, eyes scanning the darkness with the methodical intensity of a man who knows that the most dangerous moment of any extraction is the exit. They cleared the fence. They reached the tree line. They were 50 yards into the forest when Cooper's phone buzzed. He pulled it out. Unknown number. He answered. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, warm, even. The voice of a man who has practiced sounding reasonable until it became indistinguishable from actually being reasonable. "Hello, Cooper." Cooper stopped walking. Everyone stopped. "Who is this?" "I think you know." "Daniel Marsh." The voice continued without waiting for confirmation. "You have something of mine. I have something of yours." Cooper's blood went cold. "I stopped by your clubhouse about 20 minutes ago. Lovely place, very rustic. That leather couch in the main room? Comfortable. Your friend Brennan thought so too before he took a nap." A pause. Deliberately timed. Deliberately long. "But the boy, Charlie." He was already awake, packed his little notebook and everything, almost like he was expecting someone. Cooper's hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Miranda had gone rigid. Her eyes were wide, her mouth was open. She recognized the voice. "Here's what's going to happen," Daniel said. His tone hadn't changed, still calm, still warm. The voice of a man who chaired fundraisers and shook hands with mayors. "You're going to bring Miranda back to Pine Ridge. You're going to leave her there. And you're going to go back to your little club and forget any of this ever happened. If you do that, I'll drop Charlie off at the county line in the morning, unharmed. And if I don't?" A long silence. Then a sound in the background. Small, distant, but unmistakable. A boy's voice. Muffled. Trying not to cry. "Then this conversation becomes the last time you hear his voice," Daniel said. The line went dead. Cooper stood in the frozen forest with the phone pressed against his ear, listening to nothing. Miranda had collapsed against Macklin's shoulder, shaking. Harlan had both hands on the crowbar, gripping it so hard the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. Dex was staring at Cooper with an expression that said everything without words, that said they had walked into a trap that had been set before they'd even started walking. Daniel Marsh hadn't panicked. He hadn't scrambled. He hadn't reacted. He had anticipated every move, every step, every decision Cooper had made since Charlie walked through the clubhouse door, and now he held the one thing they couldn't afford to lose. Cooper lowered the phone. The screen went dark. The forest pressed in around them, silent and vast and indifferent. Behind them, the Pine Ridge facility sat empty and dark. Ahead of them, somewhere in the night, a boy with a red notebook was in the hands of the man he'd spent 6 months trying to escape. Miranda lifted her head from Macklin's shoulder. Her eyes were wet. Her voice was wrecked. But beneath the terror, beneath the exhaustion, beneath 6 months of isolation in a concrete room, there was something else. "I know where he'll take him," she said. Miranda was barefoot on frozen ground, and she was talking. Not the way a rescued person talks. Scattered, disoriented, clinging to the nearest body for warmth and reassurance. She was talking the way a woman talks when the terror has burned through every other emotion and what's left underneath is something cold and operational and precise. Her feet were bleeding. She didn't notice. The pine needles and frozen earth cut into her soles with every step, leaving dark smears on the forest floor, and she kept walking, kept talking, her voice cracked but steady, her eyes fixed on something none of them could see. "There's a lake," she said. 12 miles east of Ridgehaven, past the old lumber mill. A service road runs along the north shore for about 2 miles and then dead ends at a property that used to be a fish processing plant. It closed 8 years ago. Daniel bought it through one of the shells, not the 3 you found. A fourth one I never told anyone about because I didn't find it until 3 days before he took me. Cooper was walking beside her, matching her pace, his jaw tight, his phone still in his hand like a weapon he hadn't figured out how to use. The forest was dark around them. Moonlight came through the canopy and broken pieces that fell across their path like shattered glass. "A fourth shell company," Macklin said from behind them. His voice was flat. The flatness of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. "Lakeshore Industrial Holdings," Miranda said. "Registered in Delaware. I found it on his laptop the night he forgot to lock his office. There was a folder inside a folder, inside a folder. The kind of nesting that only exists when someone is hiding something they're terrified of anyone finding. The processing plant is listed as the sole physical asset." "Why there?" Dex asked. He was moving at the rear of the group, walking backward every few steps to scan the darkness behind them, bolt cutters still slung over his shoulder, his scar a pale line in the moonlight. "Because it's where he keeps the things he can't explain." The words landed and nobody picked them up for a long time. They reached the bikes at 7:23 p.m. The engines were cold. The chrome was frosted. Cooper's hands were numb inside his gloves as he gripped the handlebars and felt the familiar weight of the machine beneath him. The only thing in the past 36 hours that felt solid, that felt like it belonged to a world he understood. Miranda couldn't ride. Her feet were shredded. Her body was shaking from cold and adrenaline and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 6 months in a room where every day is identical and then being thrown back into a world that moves too fast. Macklin took her on the back of his bike, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders, and she gripped his waist with hands that were stronger than they looked. Cooper radioed Roach at the Fire Road junction. "Status." Roach's voice came back tight. "Two vehicles passed on Route 9 about 15 minutes ago, heading south, moving fast. One was a black SUV, the other was a county cruiser. Heading south, toward Ridgehaven." "Toward the clubhouse," Roach said. Cooper's stomach dropped. He keyed the radio again. "Brennan, come in." Static. "Brennan, respond." Static. "Brennan!" Nothing. Cooper stared at the radio in his hand. Daniel's words echoed in his skull with the mechanical precision of a recording. Your friend Brennan thought so too before he took a nap. He'd assumed Daniel meant Brennan had been knocked unconscious. A pistol whip. A taser. Something fast and temporary. But what if he was wrong? "We need to move," Cooper said. "Now." The formation tore down the fire road in the dark, engines screaming against the frozen air, gravel spraying behind them in rooster tails that caught the moonlight and disappeared. At the junction, Roach and his bike folded into the formation without slowing down. 5 bikes. 1 passenger. No headlights. Moving south through back roads at speeds that turned the pine trees on either side into a continuous black wall. Cooper's mind was running 2 parallel tracks. The first was tactical. Distance, time, routes, the layout of the clubhouse, the number of entrances, the location of every window and every blind spot he'd spent years memorizing. The second was something else. Something older. Something that lived in the same place as the memory of his own father's voice, calm and measured, explaining why the bruise on Cooper's arm was his own fault. Daniel Marsh's voice on the phone had sounded exactly like that. The same cadence, the same warmth, the same absolute, unshakable certainty that the world operated according to rules he had written, and everyone else was simply failing to follow. Cooper had spent 30 years trying to outrun that voice. Tonight, it had called him by name. They reached the clubhouse at 8:09 p.m. The front door was open. Not broken, not forced. Open. The way a door is left open when the person who opened it wants you to see what's inside. Cooper dismounted before his bike fully stopped. The engine died. The silence that replaced it was enormous. He crossed the parking lot in 6 strides, boots crunching on frost, and stopped at the threshold. Inside, the clubhouse was dark. The overhead lights were off. The only illumination came from the neon beer signs behind the bar, casting everything in a sick blue and red glow that made the room look like it was breathing. Brennan was on the floor, lying on his back near the pool table, one arm extended, the other folded across his chest. His eyes were closed. A bruise was forming along the left side of his jaw. Swollen, already darkening, the clear imprint of something hard and metallic. A pistol butt. Maybe a flashlight. His breathing was shallow but steady. Cooper knelt beside him. "Brennan." No response. "Brennan." Harder now. A groan. Brennan's eyelids flickered. His pupils were uneven when they finally opened. One dilated wider than the other. Concussion. Possibly worse. "How many?" Cooper asked. Brennan tried to speak. His lips moved, but the words came out broken, reassembled in the wrong order. He closed his eyes, swallowed, and tried again. 3. Came through the back. I didn't hear them until... He winced. His hand moved to his jaw. "The kid. They took the kid." "Cooper, I tried. I know. I tried to stop them, and they... I know. Don't move." Cooper stood up. His hands were fists at his sides. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, the edges going dark the way they did when something inside him shifted from thinking to reacting, from planning to the raw, unfiltered clarity that sits on the other side of rage. Macklin appeared in the doorway, Miranda leaning on his arm. She looked at Brennan on the floor, and her face went white. "He'll do worse to Charlie," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't understand. You don't understand what he is." "Then tell me," Cooper said. Miranda looked at Macklin, then at Harlan, who had entered behind her and was standing with his back against the wall, crowbar still in hand, his face carved from something harder than stone. Then at Dex, who was checking Brennan's pupils with a pen light, his movements clinical and sure. She looked at all of them, and something in her expression changed. Not the breaking she'd shown at Pine Ridge, but a decision. The decision to open a door she had kept locked because the thing behind it was too dangerous to let out. The charity fraud is real, she said. The shell companies, the missing money, the trucks, all of it. But that's not why Daniel locked me away. The room went still. I found something else. Miranda's hands were trembling. She pressed them together in front of her, fingers interlaced, knuckles white. Something worse. Cooper waited. The neon light pulsed blue. Red. Blue. The money Daniel was funneling through the shells, it wasn't going into his pocket. Not most of it. He was paying people. Officials. County administrators. Zoning board members. School board members. The sheriff. The county health inspector. A state legislator. 13 people in total. Monthly payments. Cash and wire transfers. Documented. Categorized. Daniel kept records of everything because the records were his insurance. If anyone ever turned on him, he had proof that they were complicit. 13 people, Macklin said slowly. 13. And that's just the ones I found before he caught me looking. There could be more. Miranda paused. Her breathing was unsteady, but her voice held. The Valley Bridge Foundation isn't a charity that became corrupt. It was built from the beginning as a bribery network. The community programs are real, just enough to maintain the cover, just enough to make the public believe. But the actual purpose of the foundation, from the first dollar raised, was to buy control of Ridgehaven. The silence that followed was different from any silence Cooper had experienced in this room. It wasn't the heavy silence of disagreement or the tense silence of a decision being made. It was the silence of a foundation cracking, the sound a building makes right before it comes down. Buy control, Harlan repeated. Control of what? Everything. Miranda looked at him. Zoning, permits, inspections, law enforcement, education, healthcare oversight. You think it's a coincidence that every development project in Ridgehaven for the past 5 years has gone through the same 3 contractors? That the county health department hasn't issued a single violation against a marsh-connected business? That the school district awarded its transportation contract to a company that doesn't exist outside of a P.O. box? She was shaking harder now. Macklin moved closer to her, not touching, just close enough that she could feel his presence. Daniel doesn't just run a charity, Miranda said. He runs Ridgehaven, the whole town. And nobody knows it because the control is invisible. It's built into the paperwork, the permits, the appointments. The sheriff doesn't just protect Daniel. Daniel owns the sheriff. Daniel owns the zoning board. Daniel owns enough of the county government that he can make anything happen or make anything disappear. Including you, Cooper said. Miranda flinched. A small, involuntary contraction, like something physical hitting something raw. Including me. The room absorbed this. Cooper stood motionless, processing the scale of what Miranda had just described. He'd walked into this thinking it was a rescue mission. Find a missing woman, expose a charity fraud, get out. What Miranda was describing was something else entirely. A shadow government. An entire town operated from behind a curtain by a man whose public face was so carefully constructed that even the people paying attention couldn't see through it. And now that man had Charlie. The lake, Cooper said. The processing plant. You said that's where he keeps the things he can't explain. What things? Miranda closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were no tears. Just the flat, exhausted clarity of someone who has already done their crying and has nothing left but facts. The original records, the real books, every payment, every bribe, every name, every date. Daniel keeps physical copies of everything in a safe at the lakeside facility because he doesn't trust digital storage. He's seen too many people get caught by hard drives and cloud accounts. The paper trail is his leverage, his guarantee. As long as he controls those records, nobody in his network can turn on him without destroying themselves. And that's where he'll take Charlie, Cooper said. Yes. Why? Miranda's face contorted. Because Charlie is the only person alive who has independently documented enough of the operation to corroborate what's in those records. The notebook. 47 lies, with dates and details and license plates and names. If Charlie's notebook ever reaches an investigator who also has access to Daniel's records, the entire network is exposed. Every bribe, every official, every payment. Daniel can't destroy the records because they're his protection. He can't destroy the notebook without destroying Charlie's memory of everything in it. She paused. So he'll do what he always does. He'll contain the threat, the way he contained me. He's going to lock up his own son, Dex said from the floor where he was still monitoring Brennan. His voice was quiet, but it carried a voltage that made everyone in the room look at him. In a concrete room, the way he locked up his wife. For as long as it takes, Miranda whispered. Cooper turned away. He walked to the window and stood there, looking out at the parking lot where 5 motorcycles sat cooling in the frost. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Older than he felt, harder than he wanted to be, carrying the weight of a decision that had stopped being simple the moment a 13-year-old boy walked through his door. Behind him, Harlan spoke. Quietly, the way he spoke when the stakes were too high for volume. Cooper, there's something else you need to know. Cooper turned. Harlan was looking at Miranda with an expression Cooper had never seen on the old Marine's face before. Not anger, not fear, something between recognition and dread. What? Cooper said. Harlan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the floor, then at his hands, then at Cooper. I know about the network. I've known for 2 years. The words detonated. Every head in the room turned. Macklin straightened from the whiteboard. Dex looked up from Brennan. Roach, who had been standing silently near the garage entrance for the past 10 minutes, took a step forward. Even Brennan, half conscious on the floor, opened his eyes. What did you say? Cooper's voice was low, dangerously low. The register below anger, where the words come out flat and each syllable hits like a separate blow. 2 years ago, Harlan said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. A man came to me. Not Marsh. Someone in his network. A county official I'd done some work for. Legitimate work. Construction permits for the clubhouse expansion. He told me that certain people in the county government had an arrangement, a mutual protection agreement. He said they were always looking for people who could be useful and that the Iron Ledger could benefit from having friends in the right places. And you said yes? The question came from Macklin, and it came out like breaking glass. I said no. Harlan met Macklin's eyes. I told him the club wasn't interested. He said that was fine, but he asked me to keep quiet about the conversation, said it would be better for everyone. And you kept quiet, Cooper said. I kept quiet. The silence that followed was the worst Cooper had ever experienced. Worse than the silence after a funeral. Worse than the silence in a courtroom. The silence of a trust being weighed and found damaged. Not shattered. Harlan had refused the offer, had turned away the money, had declined the corruption, but damaged nonetheless because he had known. He had known for 2 years that something was wrong in Ridgehaven, and he had chosen to look away. You knew, Cooper said. You knew someone was running a bribery network in this town. And when a 13-year-old kid walked through our door yesterday with a notebook full of evidence, you stood right there. He pointed to the garage doorway and told me this was not our fight. Harlan's face didn't change, but something behind it shifted, something structural, like a beam giving way deep inside a wall. I wasn't trying to protect Marsh. I was trying to protect the club. From what? From exactly this. Harlan gestured at the room. The maps, the documents, the unconscious man on the floor, the barefoot woman shaking in the doorway, the empty couch where a boy had slept the night before. From getting pulled into something bigger than us. Something we can't fight and can't outrun. Cooper, I've been in wars, real ones, with uniforms and ranks and rules of engagement. This isn't a war, this is a system. And you don't beat a system by riding into the dark with bolt cutters and crowbars. Apparently you don't beat it by keeping quiet either, Dex said. The words landed like a slap. Harlan absorbed them. His jaw worked. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Cooper stared at the man he'd trusted more than anyone in the club for 15 years. The man who had taught him how to read a room. How to lead without shouting. How to carry decisions that would keep him awake at 3 a.m. for years afterward. The man who had stood beside him at funerals, at hospital bedsides, at the edges of cliffs both literal and metaphorical, and had always, always, been the steady hand in the dark. And for 2 years, that hand had been holding a secret. Who else knows? Cooper asked. Nobody. I never told anyone. Who was the official? Harlan hesitated, just for a second. But Cooper saw it. The flicker of calculation behind the eyes, the split-second debate between full disclosure and self-preservation that happens so fast most people don't even know they're doing it. Tom Avery, County Public Works Director. Miranda made a sound. Small. Involuntary. Cooper looked at her. Her face had gone gray. Tom Avery is number 6 on Daniel's list, she said. He handles the construction permits for every project that uses foundation money. He's been receiving payments since the beginning. Cooper looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the floor. The room was very quiet for a long time. Then Cooper did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked to Harlan, stood directly in front of him, and spoke at a volume that only the two of them could hear. You're going to ride with me tonight. You're going to help me get that boy back. And when this is over, you and I are going to have a conversation about what the word brother means. But right now, I need your head in this. Can I have it? Harlan looked up. His eyes were wet. Not crying. Harlan didn't cry, hadn't cried since a village in a country he never named, but wet with something that was close enough to matter. You have it, he said. Then let's move. Cooper turned to the room. The neon light pulsed. Blue, red, blue. The shadows it threw across the walls made everything look like it was underwater. Distorted, unstable, shifting. Macklin, I need you to call Sharon Kessler. Tell her everything Miranda just told us. The 4th Shell Company, the bribery network, the 13 names. She wanted evidence? She's about to get more than she bargained for. Tell her to have the federal warrant ready and the FBI on standby. What about Brennan? Roach stays with Brennan. Nobody leaves this clubhouse until they hear from me. Roach nodded. He moved to Brennan's side and knelt, placing one hand on the injured man's shoulder. Miranda. Cooper turned to her. She was standing straighter now, despite the bleeding feet, despite the trembling, despite everything. Something had changed in her since she'd started talking. The telling had given her something back. Not strength exactly, but structure. A spine rebuilt from the truth she'd been carrying alone for too long. I need you to tell me exactly how to get to the processing plant. Every turn, every landmark, every detail. I can do better than that, she said. I can take you there. No. Cooper, you've been locked in a room for 6 months. Your feet are bleeding. You can barely stand. He has my son. The 4 words cut through every argument Cooper could have made. Not because they were loud. They weren't. Miranda said them at barely above a whisper. But they carried the weight of 6 months of concrete walls, of missed birthdays, of waking up every morning knowing that somewhere in the world, a 13-year-old boy was fighting alone because the one person who was supposed to protect him had been removed from the equation. Cooper looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Macklin. Macklin shrugged. She knows the route. She knows the building. She knows Marsh. We're riding into a facility controlled by a man who anticipated every move we've made so far. We need every advantage. She rides with Macklin, Cooper said. If things go wrong, Macklin gets her out first. Non-negotiable. Miranda nodded. Macklin nodded. Cooper looked at his watch. 8:47 p.m. Daniel had called at 7:19 p.m. An hour and 28 minutes. If Daniel was heading to the lakeside facility with Charlie, and if the facility was 12 miles east of Ridgehaven, he'd been there for at least 45 minutes already. 45 minutes in a building with a safe full of incriminating records and a boy whose testimony could bring down an empire. Every minute they stood here was a minute Daniel had to solidify his control. Dex, Harlan, with me. Cooper pulled his jacket tight and walked toward the door. We ride in 3. Outside, the night had turned brutal. The temperature had plummeted past freezing into something that felt personal. A cold that found every gap in your clothing, every patch of exposed skin, every vulnerable point on your body, and pressed into it with a patience that felt deliberate. The sky was clear for the first time in days, and the stars were out, but they gave no warmth, just light. The distant, indifferent light of things that existed too far away to care about what happened beneath them. 4 engines fired. The sound split the night apart. Exhaust clouds rose thick and white in the freezing air, curling around chrome and leather before dissolving into darkness. Cooper led the formation east out of the parking lot, past the shuttered storefronts and dark windows of downtown Ridgehaven, past the gas station where a single fluorescent light turned the pavement a sickly green, past the elementary school where Daniel Marsh's name was engraved on a brass plaque by the front entrance. Miranda rode behind Macklin with her arms locked around his waist and her cheek pressed against his back. Her bare feet hung on either side of the bike, purple with cold, streaked with dried blood. She didn't make a sound. They cleared the town limits in 4 minutes. The road opened up, long and straight, bordered by empty farmland on both sides. The kind of road that feels like it goes on forever because there's nothing on either side to mark your progress. The headlights cut white tunnels through the darkness. The wind screamed past at 60 miles an hour, pulling tears from the corners of Cooper's eyes and turning his face into a mask of numbness. At mile 8, Miranda's hand tapped Macklin's shoulder. Once. Twice. Macklin slowed. The formation slowed behind him. She pointed left. A road. Unmarked. Cracked asphalt. Leading into a stretch of forest that bordered the lake, Cooper could just barely see. A flat, dark expanse that reflected nothing, absorbing moonlight like a hole cut in the world. They turned. The road wound through the trees for 2 miles. No streetlights, no signs. No indication that anyone had driven this road in years, except for one thing. Fresh tire tracks in the frost-covered asphalt. 2 sets, one wider than the other. A sedan and something larger. An SUV. Cooper's grip tightened on the handlebars. The processing plant appeared a quarter-mile later, rising from the tree line like something that had been trying to hide and failed. A long, low building, corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, loading docks on the south side, a parking area covered in cracked concrete and dead weeds. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate was open. 2 vehicles were parked inside the fence, a black sedan, a black SUV, and standing between them, illuminated by the SUV's headlights, a man in a dark overcoat talking on a phone. Not Daniel Marsh, Sheriff Dale Whitmore. Cooper killed his engine 200 yards from the fence. The others followed. In the sudden silence, they could hear Whitmore's voice, distant, distorted by cold air, but audible in fragments. Inside with the boy. He wants another 20 minutes. I told him, doesn't matter what she said, nobody's going to... Handled. The club doesn't have the resources to... Cooper dismounted. Dex appeared beside him, silent as a shadow. Harlan materialized on the other side, crowbar in hand. 2 vehicles, Dex whispered. Whitmore plus at least 2 more inside with Marsh, maybe 3. Armed? Cooper asked. Whitmore's got his service weapon. Beyond that, I can't tell from here. Cooper looked at this building. Through a single lit window on the ground floor, he could see movement, shapes, silhouettes against industrial fluorescent light. One shape was smaller than the others. Charlie. Macklin's hand touched Cooper's shoulder from behind. Kessler's got the message. She's activating the federal warrant. FBI field office is 40 minutes out. 40 minutes, Cooper repeated. The number tasted like metal on his tongue. 40 minutes with Charlie inside that building. 40 minutes with a man who had already demonstrated that he would imprison his own wife to protect his empire. 40 minutes with a sheriff standing guard outside who had every legal and practical reason to make sure nobody interfered. Cooper had been in situations where the odds were bad. He'd ridden into towns where the welcome was a loaded gun and the exit was a prayer. He'd stood in rooms where every face was hostile and the only way out was through. But this was different. This wasn't hostile territory. This was a trap that had been built specifically for him, by a man who had studied his movements and predicted his choices and laid every piece of bait with the precision of a chess player who sees the end of the game before the first piece moves. And Cooper had walked into it anyway, because a boy with a red notebook had asked for help, and Cooper was the kind of man who couldn't say no to that, and Daniel Marsh had known it, had counted on it. The realization hit Cooper with a force that went beyond thought. It was physical, a contraction in his chest, a tightening in his throat. The understanding that everything he was, his protectiveness, his loyalty, his refusal to abandon people the system had failed, was precisely the set of qualities that Daniel Marsh had weaponized against him. Cooper closed his eyes. The cold pressed against his face. The distant hum of the building's generator vibrated in his chest. Behind him, his brothers waited in the darkness, battered, exhausted, carrying their own wounds and their own reasons for being here. None of them whole, none of them sure, all of them standing on the edge of something that could destroy them. He opened his eyes. "We don't wait for the FBI," he said. Dex looked at him. Harlan looked at him. Macklin looked at him. "We go in now." Dex takes Whitmore outside, silent, fast. Harlan and I go through the loading dock. Macklin stays with Miranda at the perimeter. "If we're not out in 15 minutes, you take her and you ride until you reach Kessler. You give Kessler everything, the names, the records, the shell companies, everything." "Cooper," Macklin started, "if we don't come out, the evidence still reaches the right people. Charlie's notebook is in there. Miranda's testimony is out here. Between those two things, the case stands, but only if someone survives to deliver it." The words hung in the cold air. No one moved. Then Harlan stepped forward. He held the crowbar across his body, both hands wrapped around the metal, and he looked at Cooper with an expression that had no calculation in it, no self-preservation, no strategic thinking, just the raw, unfinished, imperfect loyalty of a man who had made a mistake and was choosing, in this moment, to be something better than the sum of his failures. "On your lead," Harlan said. Cooper nodded once, and they moved toward the building where a boy sat counting lies in the dark, waiting for someone to come through the door. Dex moved first. He crossed the open ground between the tree line and the fence in 11 seconds. Cooper counted, the way he always counted during operations, because counting kept the panic at a distance, gave the brain something mechanical to hold on to while the body did things the brain would rather not think about. 11 seconds of exposed terrain, frost-covered concrete, moonlight bright enough to throw shadows. Dex's boots made no sound. His body stayed low, angled, moving with the fluid economy of a man who had learned a long time ago that the difference between being seen and not being seen was not about speed, but about the absence of unnecessary movement. Whitmore was still on the phone. His back was half turned toward the SUV. His free hand was resting on his belt, near his holstered service weapon, but loosely, the way a man rests his hand on something out of habit rather than readiness. Dex reached the SUV. He came around the rear bumper in a crouch. Whitmore was 4 feet away. 3, 2. The phone call ended. Whitmore lowered the phone and began to turn. Dex hit him from behind. Not a punch. A controlled application of body weight, driving Whitmore forward into the side of the SUV with enough force to knock the wind out of him, but not enough to cause a sound louder than the dull thud of a body against sheet metal. Whitmore's phone clattered to the ground. His hand grabbed for the holster. Dex's hand got there first. He stripped the weapon, ejected the magazine, and racked the slide to clear the chamber, all in a single motion that took less than 2 seconds. The gun went into the back of Dex's waistband. The magazine went into his jacket pocket. Whitmore tried to shout. Dex's forearm pressed across his throat, not crushing, not choking, but applying enough pressure to make shouting impossible without making breathing impossible either. The line between those two things was razor thin, and Dex walked it the way he walked every line, with the absolute precision of someone who has practiced restraint until it became more natural than violence. "Listen," Dex whispered. His mouth was an inch from Whitmore's ear. "You have 2 choices. Quiet and conscious, or loud and unconscious. Pick now." Whitmore went still. Dex zip-tied his wrists behind his back, then his ankles. He pulled the sheriff's own handkerchief from his breast pocket and wadded it into a gag. Whitmore's eyes were wild above the cloth, furious and terrified in equal measure. The eyes of a man who has spent years on the comfortable side of authority and is experiencing for the first time what it feels like to be on the other side. Dex dragged him behind the SUV and left him propped against the rear tire. Then he keyed his radio. 1 click. The signal. Cooper and Harlan moved. They came from the east side, hugging the fence line until they reached the loading dock on the building's south face. 3 concrete steps. A steel roll-up door, partially raised. 2 feet of clearance between the bottom edge and the dock floor. Yellow light spilled out from underneath, cutting a bright rectangle across the concrete. Cooper dropped flat and looked under the door. A large open space. Industrial. The remains of the processing plant's original function were still visible. Stainless steel tables bolted to the floor, drainage channels cut into the concrete, hooks hanging from ceiling-mounted rails that hadn't been used in years. The fluorescent lights were on. 6 panels, 2 of them flickering with the erratic pulse of dying ballasts. The air that seeped through the gap smelled like rust and damp concrete and old fish, and something chemical that Cooper couldn't identify. In the center of the room, directly beneath the brightest light, Charlie sat in a metal folding chair. His hands were zip-tied behind the back of the chair. His red notebook was on a table 5 feet in front of him, open to a page that Cooper couldn't read from this distance. The boy's face was pale, but composed. The same eerie composure he'd worn when he first walked into the clubhouse. The composure of someone who has learned that showing fear is more dangerous than feeling it. Daniel Marsh stood behind the table. Cooper saw him clearly for the first time. Tall, lean, mid-40s, the kind of face that belongs on campaign posters, clean-shaven, symmetrical, with eyes that radiated intelligence and warmth in equal measure. He was wearing a dark blue suit, no tie, the collar open. His shoes were polished. His hair was neat. He looked like he'd just come from a board meeting, not a kidnapping. The contrast between his appearance and the setting, the polished man in the rusted factory, was so stark it felt deliberate. A performance. Everything about Daniel Marsh was a performance. 2 men stood near the far wall, large, heavy coats, the kind of men who get hired for their size and their willingness to not ask questions. Private security. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them, watching the room with the blank, detached attention of people who are being paid by the hour and don't care about the context. 4 total. Daniel. 2 security. And Whitmore, who was now zip-tied behind the SUV. Cooper pulled back from the gap and looked at Harlan. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed at the loading dock door, then pointed at himself and Harlan. Harlan nodded. He adjusted his grip on the crowbar. His knuckles were white. His breathing was controlled, the deliberate, measured breathing of a man who has trained himself to regulate his body's responses under stress, because the alternative is letting those responses make decisions for him. Cooper keyed his radio twice. 2 clicks. Dex's response came back immediately. 1 click. In position. Cooper took a breath. The air was so cold it burned. He could feel his heartbeat in his wrists, in his throat, in the hollow space behind his sternum where fear and determination occupied the same territory. He rolled under the loading dock door. The concrete floor was freezing against his palms. He came up in a crouch behind a row of steel tables, rusted, heavy, bolted to the floor in a line that ran perpendicular to the door. Harlan rolled in behind him. The crowbar scraped against the concrete with a sound so small it was swallowed by the hum of the fluorescent lights. Daniel was talking. His voice carried across the open space with the casual authority of a man who is accustomed to being the only voice in any room. "You understand why we're here, don't you, Charlie?" Charlie said nothing. "I'm not angry. I want you to understand that. I am not angry. I'm disappointed, which I think you know is different. Anger is reactive. Disappointment is structural." Daniel picked up the red notebook and flipped through the pages with his thumb. The sound of turning paper was loud in the empty building. 47 lies. That's what you told them. 47 lies in 1 week. Do you know what that number really means? Charlie's jaw was tight. His eyes were fixed on a point on the wall above his father's head. "It means you've been paying attention. And paying attention is a skill I've always admired in you. It's one of the things that makes you special." Daniel set the notebook down. But paying attention to the wrong things, bringing that attention to the wrong people, that's not a skill. That's a liability. "They're not the wrong people," Charlie said. His voice was low, steady, the same practiced steadiness he'd walked into the clubhouse with, except now there was something underneath it, something raw and shaking that the steadiness was barely containing. "They're criminals, Charlie. Felons. Men who live outside the law and call it freedom. They don't care about you. They care about what you represent. A weapon they can use against me. A child's testimony is powerful in court. Everyone knows that. Juries love children. Prosecutors love children. Your biker friends know that, and they're using you." "They listen to me." Of course they listened. That's how recruitment works. You find someone who's been ignored, you make them feel heard, and then you use their gratitude to, the way you recruited the sheriff, the zoning board, the county health inspector. Daniel stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The building creaked. One of the security men shifted his weight from one foot to the other. What did you say? Daniel's voice had changed. Not louder, not angrier. The temperature had simply dropped out of it. The warmth was gone. What remained was flat, clinical, and empty. The voice beneath the performance. Tom Avery, Karen Whitfield, James Durant, Paul Ostrowski, Dale Whitmore. Charlie was reciting names from memory. His eyes hadn't moved from the wall. His voice hadn't wavered. Monthly payments. Cash through the Foundation's operating account. Wire transfers through Lakeshore Industrial Holdings, a shell company registered in Delaware under the name Stop. Richard Forster, which is the same alias you used to lease the storage unit on Route 14, and the same name on the title for this building. I said stop. Where you keep the original ledgers documenting every bribe you've paid since the Foundation was... Daniel crossed the distance between the table and the chair in 3 steps and struck Charlie across the face with an open hand. The sound was sharp and flat and terrible. It echoed off the metal walls and came back doubled, tripled, filling the space with its own reverberations. Charlie's head snapped to the side. His body jerked against the zip ties. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He didn't cry out, didn't flinch, didn't close his eyes. He turned his head back to center, looked at his father, and said, 48. Cooper's vision went red. Not metaphorically, not figuratively. The edges of his visual field actually darkened, and the center narrowed to a single point of focus. Daniel Marsh's hand, still raised, still open, the hand that had struck a 13-year-old boy who was tied to a chair. The same shape, the same architecture. The bruise on Charlie's arm. The bruise on Cooper's arm, 30 years ago, in a different room, from a different hand, but identical in every way that mattered. Something inside Cooper. Something old, something he'd spent 3 decades trying to contain. Something that lived in the space between the man he'd become and the boy he'd been. Broke free. He stood up from behind the steel table. Daniel saw him first. The 2 security men saw him a half-second later. Charlie saw him, and something happened in the boy's face. Not relief, not yet, but the first crack in the composure he'd been holding together with nothing but willpower and the desperate certainty that someone would come. "Get away from the boy," Cooper said. His voice was quiet. Not the quiet of restraint. The quiet of something that has moved past restraint into a territory where volume is irrelevant because the intent is so clear it doesn't need amplification. Daniel's hand lowered. He took a step back from Charlie's chair. His expression recalibrated. Cooper could actually see it happening. The micro-adjustments in the facial muscles, the shift in the eyes, the reconstruction of the mask. In less than 2 seconds, Daniel Marsh went from the man who had just struck his son to the man who ran charity drives and shook hands with mayors. "Cooper Danes," Daniel said. Warm, conversational, as if they'd bumped into each other at a grocery store. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "I said get away from the boy. He's my son. He's a child you tied to a chair. A precaution, for his own safety. He's been through a lot of confusion lately, and Harlan came around the end of the table row, crowbar in hand. The 2 security men stiffened. One of them reached inside his coat. "Don't," Harlan said. One word. The word contained 35 years of military service, 2 combat tours, and the absolute, unbluffable certainty that he would use the crowbar before the hand cleared the coat. The security man's hand stopped moving. The room froze. Daniel's eyes moved from Cooper to Harlan to the loading dock door, calculating. Even now, cornered, exposed, standing in a rusted building with his son bleeding in a chair and 2 bikers closing in, the calculation never stopped. Cooper could see it working behind those warm, intelligent eyes, like machinery running beneath a smooth surface. "This is a mistake," Daniel said. "Whatever you think you're doing here, whatever story Miranda told you, whatever fantasy Charlie has constructed in that notebook, this is a mistake that will cost you everything. I have friends in this county who..." Your friends are in handcuffs, Cooper said. Whitmore is zip-tied behind his own car. Sharon Kessler has the federal warrant. The FBI is on the way. Something flickered in Daniel's expression. Small. Fast. The first genuine emotion Cooper had seen on the man's face. Not the performed warmth, not the theatrical disappointment, but real, uncontrolled fear. It lasted less than a second. Then the mask closed back over it like water closing over a stone. Sharon Kessler is an ambitious prosecutor who has been trying to build a career on unfounded 13 names, Cooper said. He took a step forward, then another, each step deliberate, each step closing the distance between himself and the man behind the table. Monthly payments, shell companies, a bribery network designed to buy control of an entire town, physical records kept in a safe in this building because you don't trust digital storage. Miranda told us everything. And Charlie, Cooper looked at the boy. Charlie confirmed every detail from memory. Daniel's jaw tightened. The mask was holding, but the seams were showing. The warmth in his eyes had gone mechanical, like a light that's been left on after everyone has left the room. "You're a biker," Daniel said. The word carried contempt so refined it almost sounded like respect. "You live in a rundown clubhouse. You fix motorcycles for a living. You have no education, no credentials, no standing. Who do you think a jury is going to believe? A decorated community leader with 15 years of public service, or a motorcycle gang president with—" "I'm not here for a jury," Cooper said. He was close now. 6 feet from Daniel. Close enough to see the individual threads in the man's suit. Close enough to see the veins in the backs of his hands. Close enough to see the faint red mark on Charlie's cheek where his father's palm had landed. "I'm here for the boy." Daniel looked at Cooper. Cooper looked at Daniel. The distance between them was not 6 feet. It was 30 years, compressed into a single moment. Two versions of the same architecture, two men shaped by the same forces. One who had become the fist and one who had decided to stand between the fist and the face it was aimed at. "You can't save him," Daniel said quietly. The mask had slipped again. What was underneath wasn't the polished charity leader or the calculating criminal. It was something smaller, something petty and frightened and desperate. "He's mine. My blood. My name. No court in the world will give custody to a—" "I'm not talking about custody." Cooper reached down and pulled the zip ties off Charlie's wrists. The plastic snapped. Charlie's hands were white from restricted circulation, and he flexed them slowly, painfully, the blood returning with a pins and needles rush that made his fingers tremble. Cooper put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Charlie looked up at him. The blood was still wet at the corner of his mouth. The red mark on his cheek was darkening into something that would become a bruise by morning. But his eyes were clear, present, alive in a way that had nothing to do with the adrenaline and everything to do with the simple, devastating fact that someone had come. Someone had actually come. "Can you stand?" Cooper asked. "Yeah." "Then stand up." Charlie stood. His legs were unsteady. He'd been tied to the chair long enough for his muscles to cramp, but he stood. He picked up the red notebook from the table. He held it against his chest the same way he'd held it while sleeping on the clubhouse couch. And in that gesture, Cooper saw the entire arc of what this boy had done. 6 months of documenting. 6 months of knocking on doors that didn't open. 6 months of carrying evidence that could destroy an empire in a notebook that fit inside a jacket pocket because nobody in the entire structure of civilization had been willing to look at it. "We're leaving," Cooper said to Daniel. Daniel didn't move. He stood behind the table with his hands at his sides, and something was happening in his face, something seismic. The mask was dissolving, not falling off in a single dramatic reveal, but breaking apart piece by piece, like ice cracking on a river. And what was beneath it was not the monster Cooper had expected. It was smaller than a monster, weaker. A man who had built an empire out of other people's trust and was watching it come apart in a rusted building on the shore of a lake that nobody knew about. "If you walk out that door," Daniel said, and his voice was different now, stripped, raw, vibrating with something that might have been rage, or might have been panic, or might have been the sound a structure makes when the last load-bearing wall gives way. "Everything I've built will be destroyed. Everything. the foundation, the programs, the jobs. The people who depend on the people you've been stealing from, Harlan said from behind Cooper. The people I've been managing, Daniel's voice cracked. The composure shattered. For the first time, the volume in the room was his, and it was wild and uncontrolled and filled with the particular fury of a man who is accustomed to being believed and is facing, for the first time, a room full of people who don't. You think Ridgehaven runs itself? You think a town this size functions without someone making the calls? Without someone ensuring that the right projects get funded, the right people get promoted, the right decisions get made? I built this town. Every road, every school, every prison, Miranda said. Daniel spun. She was standing in the loading dock entrance, barefoot, bleeding. Macklin behind her, one hand on her shoulder, ready to pull her back at the first sign of danger. But Miranda wasn't looking at Macklin or Cooper or Harlan or the security men. She was looking at Daniel with an expression that contained no fear, no anger, no hatred, just the clear, unblinking gaze of a woman who has spent 6 months in a room staring at a wall and has used every one of those months to burn away everything inside her that this man could reach. Miranda. Daniel's voice changed again, softer now. The warmth returning, but damaged. A cracked instrument trying to play a familiar melody. Listen to me. I can explain. You locked me in a room. For your protection. You were going to make a terrible mistake, and you locked me in a room for 6 months. She took a step into the building. Her bare feet left blood on the concrete. You told our son I went overseas. You used a photo from his cousin's wedding. You changed my voicemail. You told my sister I was in an area with limited reception. Another step. And you locked our son in a chair and hit him across the face because he had the courage to tell the truth about you. Daniel's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No sound came out. Charlie moved. Not toward his father. Away from him. Toward his mother. Across the 10 feet of stained concrete between the chair and the loading dock entrance. Moving with the careful, uncertain steps of someone who has imagined a moment so many times that the reality of it feels impossible. Miranda met him in the middle. She dropped to her knees on the concrete. Her arms went around him. His arms went around her. They held each other with the desperate, crushing force of two people who have been separated by something monstrous and are trying, through the sheer physical pressure of contact, to prove that the separation is over. The sound Miranda made was not crying. It was something beneath crying. A sound that came from a place in the body that words have never reached, guttural, raw, ancient. The sound of a mother holding her child after believing for months that she might never hold him again. Charlie didn't make a sound. He just held on. His eyes were open. His face was pressed into her shoulder. His hands gripped the back of her shirt with white-knuckled force. The red notebook was crushed between them. Cooper watched. Harlan watched. Dex, who had entered through the front, watched. Macklin watched. 4 men in black leather standing in a rusted factory, watching a mother hold her son, and feeling in that single image the entire weight of why they were here. Not for justice, not for revenge, not for the thrill of the operation or the satisfaction of the righteous. For this. For the 30 seconds of silence in which a family, broken by a man who should have protected it, began to reassemble itself on a cold concrete floor. Daniel watched too. And something in him, the last structural element, the final piece of the mask that had been holding since Cooper walked in, collapsed. He lunged, not toward Miranda and Charlie, toward the table, toward the far end of the room where a steel cabinet stood against the wall, the safe, the records, the leverage. The only thing that still gave him power over the 13 people in his network, the only thing that could save him or damn everyone around him, depending on who controlled it. Cooper saw it before it happened. The shift in Daniel's weight, the pivot of his foot, the angle of his shoulders, the same predictive reading of body language that had kept Cooper alive in 100 situations where reading a man's intention a half second before it became action was the difference between walking out of a room and being carried out of it. He moved. Cooper intercepted Daniel 3 feet from the cabinet. His shoulder hit Daniel's midsection with the force of a man who weighs 210 pounds and has spent 20 years absorbing impacts on 2 wheels at highway speed. Daniel's feet left the ground. His back hit the steel table. The table didn't move, bolted to the floor, immovable, and the impact drove the air out of Daniel's lungs with a sound like a tire blowout. Daniel grabbed Cooper's jacket. His hands, manicured, soft, the hands of a man who had never done physical labor in his life, twisted the leather and pulled, trying to create space, trying to find leverage. Cooper's hands found Daniel's wrists and pinned them against the table. The two men were face to face, close enough to share breath, close enough for Cooper to see the capillaries in Daniel's eyes, the sweat beading on his forehead, the raw, unfiltered terror of a man who has controlled everything around him for 15 years and is feeling, for the first time, the complete absence of control. "Let go of me," Daniel gasped. "No. You don't understand what those records—" "I understand exactly what they are. If those records go public, 13 people go to prison, 13 families destroyed, children, spouses, people who made one mistake. They made a choice," Cooper said. His voice was steady. His hands were steady. His heartbeat was steady. Everything in him that had been shaking for the past 2 days had gone quiet, replaced by the clarity that comes when every question has been answered and the only thing left is the action. And so did you. The two security men moved. They'd been standing frozen during the confrontation, caught between loyalty to the man who paid them and the rapidly deteriorating calculus of personal risk. But now one of them stepped forward, reaching inside his coat. Harlan was there. The crowbar came down on the man's forearm. Not full force, not enough to break bone, but enough. The hand came out of the coat empty. The man staggered back, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. The second security man raised both hands. "I'm out. I'm done. I'm not paid enough for this." "Smart," Dex said from behind him. He'd appeared from nowhere, the way Dex always appeared, like a thought that arrives fully formed, and was standing close enough to the second man to make the point that running was not an option, but cooperation was. Cooper released Daniel's wrists. Daniel slumped against the table, breathing in ragged, uneven gasps. His suit was wrinkled, his hair was disordered. The polished exterior that had protected him for 15 years was gone, and what remained was just a man, sweating, gasping, afraid, sitting on a concrete floor in a building that smelled like rust and failure. The sound of sirens pierced the silence, distant at first, then closer, then unmistakable. The multitonal wail of federal vehicles moving at high speed, getting louder with every second, cutting through the night and the cold and the darkness with the mechanical urgency of a system that had finally, belatedly, begun to move. Cooper looked toward the loading dock entrance. Through the gap, he could see the tree line. Beyond it, approaching headlights. Not 2, not 3, but a convoy of them, blue and red lights flashing against the low clouds, painting the forest in colors that meant authority and consequence and the end of something that had been hidden for far too long. Sharon Kessler had made the call. The FBI was here. Cooper stepped back from Daniel. He walked across the room to where Miranda was kneeling on the floor with Charlie, both of them still holding each other, neither willing to let go. He knelt beside them. Miranda looked at him over Charlie's shoulder. Her eyes were wet. Her face was wrecked. But beneath everything, the exhaustion, the pain, the 6 months of darkness, there was something else. She mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Cooper nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Behind them, vehicle doors were opening, boots on gravel. Command shouted in the clipped, professional cadence of agents who have trained for exactly this kind of operation. Flashlight beams swept through the loading dock entrance, cutting white lines through the dusty air. Daniel Marsh sat on the floor against the steel table and watched the lights approach with the expression of a man who is seeing, for the first time, the architecture of his own collapse. Every beam, every wall, every carefully constructed support giving way in sequence, and the entire structure coming down not with an explosion, but with a slow, irreversible settling, like a building sinking into ground that was never solid enough to hold it. Cooper stood. He walked to the loading dock entrance and stepped outside into the freezing night air. The cold hit his face like a hand. His breath came in white clouds that dissolved against the blue and red lights filling the parking area. Macklin was standing by the motorcycles. His hands were in his pockets. His face was unreadable. "It's done," Cooper said. Macklin looked at him for a long time. Then he pulled one hand from his pocket and held it out. Cooper took it. They gripped. Not a handshake, not a gesture, but a hold. The kind of grip that says, "I was there. You were there. We're still here." Harlan emerged from the building, then Dex. They stood beside their bikes in the cold, watching the federal agents swarm the processing plant, watching the flashlight beams crisscross through the windows, watching the system finally do the thing it should have done 6 months ago. Nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say. Inside the building, an agent was reading Daniel Marsh his rights. The words carried through the open loading dock door, each one landing in the frozen air with the weight of a verdict that had been delayed for years and was now, finally, being delivered. And on the concrete floor of a rusted factory, a boy with a red notebook and a bruise on his cheek sat with his mother's arms around him and listened to his father's empire end, one sentence at a time. The sirens didn't stop for a long time. They layered over each other in the dark. Federal vehicles, state police cruisers, unmarked sedans with government plates, until the narrow service road along the lake's north shore was a corridor of flashing blue and red light that turned the bare trees into something skeletal and pulsing. Cooper stood beside his motorcycle at the edge of the property and watched the machinery of consequence unfold with the slow, grinding inevitability of something that should have happened years ago and was now, finally, happening all at once. Daniel Marsh was brought out of the building at 9:38 p.m. 2 agents flanked him, each holding an arm, walking him across the cracked concrete toward a waiting vehicle. His suit was torn at the shoulder. His wrists were cuffed behind his back. His face, that polished, symmetrical, camera-ready face, was slack in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the complete evacuation of the performance. There was nothing behind it. No warmth, no calculation, no charm. Just a man in expensive clothes being loaded into the back of a federal car the way cargo gets loaded into a truck. Efficiently, without ceremony, without anyone asking if he was comfortable. He didn't look at the bikers as he passed. He didn't look at anything. The 2 security men followed, cuffed, silent, cooperative in the desperate, eager way of men who have already begun calculating what they can offer in exchange for leniency. One of them was cradling the arm Harlan had struck with the crowbar. Neither of them made eye contact with anyone. Whitmore came last. 2 state troopers had retrieved him from behind the SUV where Dex had left him. The gag was gone. The zip ties had been replaced with standard-issue handcuffs. His sheriff's uniform, the pressed khaki, the polished badge, the leather belt that held the holster he'd worn every day for 11 years, looked different under the federal lights. Smaller, like a costume that had been stripped of its authority and was now just fabric and metal and the faint smell of a man who had been lying on frozen ground for 40 minutes. Whitmore did look at Cooper. Just once. As the troopers walked him past, his head turned, and their eyes met for a duration that couldn't have been longer than 2 seconds, but felt like a conversation. Whitmore's expression wasn't angry, it wasn't defiant. It was the face of a man who has been caught and knows it, and is already beginning the long, exhausting process of understanding that the life he had before this moment is over. Cooper held the gaze. He didn't nod, didn't speak, just stood with his boots on frozen concrete and his hands at his sides, and let the sheriff see exactly what he was looking at. A man in a leather jacket who had done, in 2 days, what the entire law enforcement apparatus of Ridgehaven County had been unable or unwilling to do in years. Then Whitmore was in the car. The door closed. The engine started. The vehicle pulled away. Sharon Kessler appeared 30 minutes later. She walked across the property with a phone pressed to each ear. One hand, one Bluetooth, managing simultaneous conversations with what sounded like a federal prosecutor and a state attorney general's office liaison. She was still wearing the wool coat from the clubhouse, but her posture had changed, taller, more angular. The posture of a woman who has been fighting a battle in the dark for 8 months and is now watching the lights come on. She finished both calls, pocketed both phones, and walked to where Cooper was standing. "The safe," she said. "We opened it." Cooper waited. Everything Miranda described, every ledger, every payment record, every name, 13 officials, monthly bribes going back 4 years. The paper trail is comprehensive, so Marsh documented everything: amounts, dates, account numbers, signed receipts in some cases. She paused. He kept it like a businessman keeping books, meticulous, organized, filed by name and date, as if what he was doing was just another line item in a budget. That's exactly what it was to him, Cooper said. Kessler studied him for a moment. The FBI is taking jurisdiction. Marsh will be charged federally: wire fraud, money laundering, kidnapping, false imprisonment. The state will add charges for the bribery and corruption. Whitmore's looking at obstruction, conspiracy, and accessory to kidnapping at minimum. The other 12 officials on the list will be picked up by morning. And Miranda and Charlie? Victim services is on the way: temporary housing, medical evaluation, counseling referrals. She hesitated. The boy should see a doctor tonight. That bruise on his face. I know. Kessler looked at him for a long time. The blue and red lights swept across her face in alternating waves. You understand I can't officially acknowledge what happened here tonight. As far as the federal record is concerned, the FBI located Miranda Marsh based on evidence compiled by the Assistant District Attorney's Office. The Iron Ledger Motorcycle Club was not involved. We weren't here, Cooper said. You weren't here. She held out her hand. Cooper took it. Her grip was firm and brief. The handshake of a woman who means exactly what she says and nothing more. Thank you, she said. 2 words. Delivered without inflection, without sentiment, without any of the emotional ornamentation that most people attach to gratitude. Just 2 words, spoken clearly, and then she was walking back toward the federal vehicles, already pulling out her phone again. Cooper turned to his men. They were standing beside their motorcycles in a loose formation, not arranged, not deliberate, just the natural spacing of men who have been together long enough to know where they fit in relation to each other. Macklin was leaning against his handlebars, arms crossed, the tremor in his hands barely visible in the dim light. Dex was sitting sideways on his seat, legs stretched, the scar on his jaw catching red and blue in alternation. Harlan stood apart from the others, not distant, but at the slight remove of a man who has not yet forgiven himself for something, and is not certain he deserves the company he's keeping. Roach had arrived 20 minutes ago on his bike, having left Brennan at the clubhouse in the care of a paramedic Macklin had called, and was standing with his arms folded and his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent the last 2 hours not knowing if his brothers were alive. Miranda and Charlie were sitting on the concrete steps of the loading dock. A federal agent had brought them a blanket, a single gray emergency blanket, reflective on one side, that they had wrapped around both of their shoulders so that they sat inside it like a tent, their bodies pressed together. Miranda's arm around Charlie's back and Charlie's head resting against her shoulder. A paramedic was kneeling in front of Charlie, examining the bruise on his cheek with a penlight. Charlie was tolerating it the way he tolerated everything. Still, watchful, cooperative without being compliant. The red notebook was on his lap. Cooper walked to them. His boots crunched on frozen gravel. Miranda looked up. Charlie looked up. The FBI is handling everything from here, Cooper said. They'll take you somewhere safe tonight. Medical check. Somewhere to sleep. Miranda nodded. Her face was drawn, the skin tight across her cheekbones. The exhaustion so deep it had moved past fatigue into something structural, a tiredness that lived in the architecture of her, in the way she held her shoulders, and the way her eyes moved, and the slow, careful way she breathed, as if breathing too deeply might disturb something fragile that she was trying to hold together. Where will you go? She asked. Back to the clubhouse. And then? Cooper almost smiled. Almost. The muscles around his mouth moved in the direction of a smile, but they didn't complete the journey. They stopped somewhere in the territory between acknowledgement and exhaustion, a half expression that said more than a full one would have. Same thing we always do, he said. Fix motorcycles, drink bad coffee, wait for the next thing. Miranda reached out and took his hand. Not a handshake. She just held it, the way you hold something that has been given to you at the exact moment you needed it most. Her fingers were cold. Her grip was strong. He counted every lie, she said. For 6 months. He sat in that house with a man who terrified him, and he counted every single lie, and he wrote them down, and when nobody in the world would listen, he walked into a room full of strangers and opened his notebook. Her voice cracked. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose until the crack sealed. He's 13 years old. I know, Cooper said. You came for him. He came to us first. That was the hard part. Miranda released his hand. She pulled Charlie closer, and the boy settled against her the way water settles into a space it's been kept from, naturally, completely, as if the separation had been an aberration and this was the correction. Cooper knelt in front of Charlie, eye level. The boy looked at him with those clear, watchful eyes, the eyes that had been cataloging the world since before he understood why the world needed cataloging. You did good, Cooper said. Charlie didn't respond immediately. He held Cooper's gaze, and something passed between them that didn't have a name. Not gratitude, not relief, not the bond of shared experience, but something that contained elements of all three. The recognition of one person by another across the particular distance that separates people who have carried the same kind of weight. Will I see you again? Charlie asked. Cooper considered the question. He could have given the easy answer, the yes that would make the boy feel better, the promise that would dissolve the moment he rode away. But Charlie had spent 6 months surrounded by easy answers, and he had learned to distrust them with a precision that most adults never develop. If you need to, Cooper said. Charlie nodded. He understood the difference between a promise and an offer. He understood it the way he understood everything, completely, immediately, and with the kind of acceptance that comes from having been disappointed enough times that anything less than disappearing entirely registers as loyalty. Cooper stood. He looked at Miranda one more time. She looked back. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing else to say that their faces hadn't already said. He walked to his motorcycle. Macklin was waiting. He fell into step beside Cooper, and for a while they just walked together across the frozen parking area, two men in leather jackets moving through a landscape of flashing lights and federal vehicles and the low murmur of agents conducting an operation that would be written about in court documents and case files for years to come, none of which would mention the Iron Ledger. Brennan's going to be okay, Macklin said. Paramedic confirmed a concussion, but no fracture. He's conscious and complaining, which means he's fine. Good. Cooper. Yeah. Macklin stopped walking. Cooper stopped with him. They stood facing each other in the red and blue light, and Macklin's face was doing something it rarely did, expressing openly and without defense the full extent of what was happening inside him. That room, Macklin said, where they kept her. When I saw it, the bed, the walls, the lock, I was back there. For about 10 seconds, I was completely back there. His hands were shaking again. He looked down at them, then back at Cooper. I haven't told anyone this. Not in the club. Not in the VA. Nobody. But when I was overseas, I was captured. 31 days, a room like that. Same size, same door. He swallowed. I got out. But I left part of myself in that room. And I've been looking for it ever since. Cooper said nothing. He just stood there and listened, because that was what Macklin needed. Not solutions, not sympathy, not the well-intentioned platitudes that people offer when they encounter pain they can't fix. Just a person standing still in the cold, listening, not looking away. When I carried her out of that building, Macklin continued, and his voice was steadier now, not because the emotion had passed, but because he had decided to speak through it rather than around it. Something happened. I don't know what to call it, but something in that room, the part I left behind, I think I might have picked it up. Cooper reached out and put his hand on Macklin's shoulder, held it there. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough for the weight of it to register through the leather. Long enough for Macklin to feel the pressure and understand what it meant, that the telling was enough, that the words had been received, that nothing between them had changed except the size of the silence they shared. Then Cooper dropped his hand, and they walked the rest of the way to the bikes without speaking. The formation assembled for the last time that night. 4 motorcycles, Cooper at the front, Macklin behind him, Dex, Roach. Harlan would ride at the rear, the position he always rode, the position of the man who watches the group's back, which carried a different weight tonight than it had before. Cooper looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Cooper. We're going to have that conversation, Cooper said. I know. Not tonight. No. Tonight you ride home with your brothers. Harlan's face did something complicated. A sequence of micro-expressions that moved across his features like weather across a landscape, too fast and too layered to read individually, but producing in aggregate something that looked like the beginning of a very long and difficult reckoning. He nodded once, slow, heavy, the nod of a man accepting a weight he has earned. 4 engines fired. The sound rolled across the lake, a deep guttural roar that scattered the silence and sent it running into the trees. Exhaust rose white against the flashing lights. Chrome caught the blue and red and threw it back in fragments. They pulled out of the property and onto the service road, single file, moving slowly through the corridor of federal vehicles. Agents turned to watch. Flashlight beams tracked their progress. 4 motorcycles, loud, imposing, out of place among the sedans and SUVs and tactical vehicles, rolling past the machinery of justice like something from a different century, a different world, a different understanding of how protection works. They reached the main road and turned south toward Ridgehaven. The ride back was quiet. Not the tense quiet of the ride north, the coiled, anticipatory silence of men heading into danger. This was different. This was the quiet that comes after, the exhale, the decompression, the slow release of adrenaline and fear and determination that leaves behind a particular kind of emptiness. Not unpleasant, not peaceful, but open. A space that hasn't been filled yet. A space that might become anything. Cooper rode with his hands steady on the grips, and his eyes on the road, and his mind somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about a red notebook, about the handwriting inside it, small, precise, angry, about a boy who had walked into a room full of strangers and opened that notebook and said, "I counted 47 lies this week, and in doing so had trusted the only people left to trust." About a woman who had spent 6 months behind a locked door and emerged with every piece of information necessary to dismantle the empire that had imprisoned her. About a system that had failed them both. The police, the schools, the agencies, the entire apparatus of protection that existed on paper and evaporated in practice. And about the fact that the only reason any of it had been corrected was because a 13-year-old boy had the courage to do the thing that every adult around him had been too comfortable, too compromised, or too afraid to do. The lights of Ridgehaven appeared on the horizon like a faint, uneven glow. The town was asleep. The streets were empty. The storefronts were dark. And somewhere in those dark streets, in offices and homes and county buildings, 12 people were sleeping the last uninterrupted sleep they would have for a very long time. By morning, the arrests would begin. Tom Avery, Karen Whitfield, James Durant, Paul Ostrowski, 8 others, 13 in total. The entire network that Daniel Marsh had built, name by name, payment by payment, compromise by compromise, over the course of 4 years. The foundation would be shut down. The shell companies would be dissolved. The accounts would be frozen. The money, what was left of it, would be traced and eventually returned. The machinery was in motion. It would take months. It would be ugly. It would leave scars on the town that would take years to heal, if they healed at all. But it was in motion, and nothing Daniel Marsh had built was strong enough to stop it. The clubhouse appeared at 10:52 p.m. The parking lot was quiet. The light above the front door was on, a single yellow bulb in a wire cage that cast a warm, buttery glow across the concrete. Brennan was visible through the front window, sitting upright in a chair with an ice pack held against his jaw, watching the door with the anxious attention of a man who has been waiting for hours and is trying very hard not to let the waiting consume him. When the engines pulled into the lot, Brennan stood up. He was at the door before Cooper had dismounted. His face was swollen, his left eye was half closed, but he was standing, and he was conscious, and when he saw the 4 bikes and the 4 riders, something in his expression released, a held breath, a clenched fist, a wire that had been pulled tight since the moment he'd woken up on the floor with a splitting headache in an empty clubhouse. "The kid?" Brennan asked. "Safe," Cooper said. "With his mother." Brennan closed his eyes. His hand tightened on the ice pack. He nodded twice, the rapid, involuntary nod of a man processing relief. And then he opened his eyes and stepped aside to let them in. The clubhouse smelled the same: motor oil, stale tobacco, the faint chemical trace of industrial cleaner that never quite masked either of the other two. The overhead lights buzzed at their usual frequency. The clock on the wall showed 10:57. Everything was exactly as it had been 36 hours ago, when a Tuesday morning had started with cold coffee and ended with a boy walking through the door carrying a red notebook. But nothing was the same. Cooper could feel it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure. Not with your senses, but with your body. A subtle shift in the weight of the air that tells you the weather has changed even before you see the sky. Roach went to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee. Not because anyone asked, not because anyone needed to be caffeinated at 11 o'clock at night. Because the act of making coffee, the grinding, the pouring, the waiting, the smell, was a ritual. And rituals are how men who are not good at talking about what they've been through manage to be in the same room together without the silence becoming unbearable. They sat around the long table. 5 men, 5 mugs. The coffee was hot and strong and tasted exactly like it always tasted. Bitter, over-extracted, slightly burnt. And it was the best thing Cooper had tasted in 2 days. Nobody spoke for a long time. The clock ticked. The lights buzzed. Steam rose from the mugs in thin, curling lines that dissolved before they reached the ceiling. Then Dex reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and placed it on the table. It was a page torn from a red notebook. Small, precise handwriting. A single entry. Cooper picked it up. It read, November 23rd. The bikers listened. Nobody has ever listened before. I think they're going to help. I think they might be the kind of people who help even when it's hard. I don't know why they would do that for someone they don't know. But they did. They sat down and they read every page, and they didn't tell me to talk to my counselor. Cooper asked me questions like the answers mattered. I think maybe they do. Below that, in slightly larger handwriting, as if the pen had been pressed harder, if something happens to me, this notebook is the evidence. All of it. Every name, every number, every lie. Give it to someone who will read it. Not the police. Someone who will actually read it. Cooper set the page down on the table. He stared at it for a long time. The handwriting blurred and then cleared and then blurred again, and he realized that his eyes were wet, and he didn't wipe them, because there was no one in this room who would mistake that moisture for weakness. Where did you get this? He asked. Fell out of the notebook when they were in the loading dock, Dex said. The kid didn't notice. It was on the floor. I picked it up. Cooper looked at the page, then at his men. Macklin, whose hands had finally stopped shaking, who was holding his coffee mug with both hands and staring into it with the expression of a man who has found something he's been looking for and is still adjusting to the fact that it exists. Dex, who was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed and his eyes half closed. The controlled stillness of a man who has expended exactly the amount of energy the situation required and is now allowing himself the luxury of being still. Roach, standing in the kitchen doorway with his own mug, watching the room with the quiet attention of a man who is learning, through proximity and observation, what it means to belong to something that matters. Brennan, battered and swollen, but present, his ice pack on the table and his good eye fixed on Cooper with the steadfast, undramatic loyalty of a man who was knocked unconscious, trying to protect a boy he'd known for less than a day. Harlan, at the far end of the table, his coffee untouched, his hands flat on the surface, his eyes carrying the weight of a mistake that would take time to reckon with, but that had not, and this was the part that mattered, had not prevented him from riding into the dark when the dark was where he needed to be. 6 men in a room that smelled like oil and coffee. A torn notebook page on a scarred table. The sound of the clock. The hum of the lights. The faint, distant rumble of a truck on the highway outside, carrying something somewhere through the cold. This was not a victory. Cooper understood that with the clarity that comes from having been alive long enough to know that real outcomes don't look like victories. Real outcomes look like the inside of an outlaw motorcycle clubhouse at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night in November. Tired men sitting around a table, drinking bad coffee, not saying much, carrying the knowledge that they had done something good, and that it had cost them something, and that the cost would continue to reveal itself in the days and weeks ahead, the way all costs do. But it was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. It was a woman free. A boy safe. A system exposed. A town that would wake up tomorrow to the beginning of a painful, necessary truth. And it was 6 men who had ridden into the dark, not because they were fearless, but because they were afraid of the right things, afraid of silence, afraid of complicity, afraid of being the kind of men who look at a child's bruise and decide it's someone else's problem. Cooper picked up the notebook page and folded it carefully along its original creases. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, where it sat between the leather and the worn cotton of his shirt, close enough to feel. "Tomorrow," he said. "We open at 8. Macklin, you've got the Henderson transmission. Dex, the intake valve job is still on the bench. Roach, the front end of the softail needs finishing." Macklin looked up. "Business as usual?" "Business as usual." Macklin nodded. Dex nodded. Roach nodded. Brennan nodded. Harlan, at the end of the table, nodded last. Slow, deliberate, carrying a meaning that was different from the others but pointed in the same direction. Cooper drained his coffee. Set the mug down, stood up. "Get some sleep," he said. "All of you." He walked to the front door and stepped outside. The air was cold and clear. The sky had opened up. The clouds from the past 2 days had broken apart and drifted east, leaving behind a canopy of stars so dense it looked like someone had spilled light across a dark surface. His breath came in white clouds. The parking lot was quiet. The motorcycles sat in their row, cooling, ticking, their chrome catching the starlight in small, scattered fragments. Cooper stood on the steps and looked at the sky for a long time. He thought about a boy walking across frozen ground to a building he'd never been to, carrying a notebook he'd filled with evidence nobody wanted, to ask for help from people the world had told him to be afraid of. He thought about what it cost a 13-year-old to do that. He thought about what it cost to listen. Behind him, the clubhouse door opened and closed as his men drifted to their bunks. The sounds were small and familiar. Boots on concrete, a faucet running, a chair scraping, a light clicking off. The sounds of a place settling into itself. The sounds of home, or the closest thing to home that any of them had. Far to the east, past the ridgeline, past the lake, past the forest where a facility sat empty and dark with its doors standing open for the first time. The horizon was changing color. Not sunrise, it was too early for that. Just the first suggestion of it. A thinning of the darkness at the edge of the world. A promise that the night would end. The way all nights end, not with fanfare, but with the slow, patient arrival of something brighter. Cooper watched it for a while. Then he went inside, closed the door behind him, and sat down in the chair by the window where he'd spent the previous night watching the parking lot and wondering if he was making the right choice. He knew now he'd made the only choice, the one that lets you sleep. And for the first time in 2 days, sitting in that chair, with the sounds of his brothers settling around him and the first light beginning its long approach across the eastern sky, Cooper Danes closed his eyes. The notebook page pressed against his chest like a heartbeat. Outside, the motorcycles cooled and ticked in the darkness, patient machines waiting for whatever road came next, gleaming faintly in the starlight like sentinels who had finished their watch and were resting now, silent, steady, ready, until they were needed again.